Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to the shadowy corridors and drafty bedchambers of medieval castles, where romance was rare, privacy was laughable, and let's be honest, you probably won't survive this. Not because of a joust or a plague rat, although both are highly likely, but because you might die of second-hand embarrassment from just how awkward and earthy sex really was back then. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not saying there's a chastity belt of guilt clamped around this ask, but you know, medieval theme and all. Also, drop your city and what time you're watching this in the comments. Are you dozing off at midnight in Manchester, or catching this at sunrise in Manila? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, first things first, chastity belts. They've become the punchline of every Renaissance fair and cartoon about horny knights and nervous noblewomen. But here's the real kicker. They probably weren't real. At least not in the way you've been led to believe. Those iron underpants with terrifying locks and ventilation holes? Most were made centuries after the medieval period, likely as gag gifts, moral warnings, or museum hoaxes. In fact, many supposed authentic chastity belts in European museums have been quietly relabelled or removed entirely after closer examination revealed 19th century forgery techniques. Turns out, medieval folks were weird, but not that weird. So if there weren't rows of locked-up ladies clanking around castles, what was going on behind those stone walls? Well, everything. And almost none of it was subtle. Imagine this. You're in a smoky, echoing great hall with torchlight bouncing off rough stone. Dogs are fighting over scraps under the table. You've just eaten something called blancmange made with fish, rice and almonds, and now it's bedtime. But here's the twist. Your bedroom is actually a curtained-off alcove next to 5 other people, including your brother, your wife, and possibly a servant named Giles who's already snoring. Privacy, as we think of it today, was basically non-existent in most castles. The architecture itself didn't allow for it. Bedrooms were communal, curtains were a luxury, and people slept wherever was warm. Sometimes that meant cramming into one bed for body heat. And if the lord and lady of the castle did get a private chamber, guess what, it wasn't that private. Servants came and went constantly, tending fires, laying out clothes, even listening in on conversations to report back to someone else. That quiet, moonlit moment of medieval passion. Yeah, it came with background noise and about 4 witnesses. Despite all this, sex was everywhere. Not always in the romantic or even consensual sense, but as a constant part of life. You couldn't escape it, not with chamber pots being emptied out windows or birthing happening just 1 floor down. Castle life was, in a word, bodily. It smelled, it echoed, it involved squeaky floorboards and creaky joints, and yet, amid all that, people still found ways to flirt, seduce, and, occasionally, fall in love. And when they did, it was rarely about just the 2 of them. Marriages were mostly strategic, especially among nobility. Your job as a young noblewoman wasn't to find the love of your life. It was to bring a dowry, breed heirs, and hopefully not die in childbirth. For noblemen, the arrangement came with political advantages, land transfers, and sometimes the added bonus of marrying someone young enough to have never formed her own opinions. The wedding night? That was a whole thing. Sometimes the lord and lady's first coupling was witnessed by family members to ensure consummation. And let me tell you, the phrase awkward third wheel doesn't even begin to cover it. But here's a quirky little twist. Despite the prim and pious image the church tried to paint, people were still, well, people. They fooled around. They flirted. They read some very NSFW manuscripts hidden in the margins of illuminated texts. That's right. While monks were copying the Bible by candlelight, some couldn't resist doodling explicit scenes in the corners. You'd turn a page to find a tiny nun spanking a knight or a man sprouting, inappropriate foliage. Call it medieval meme culture. Even the church, that looming presence of guilt and moral regulation, couldn't fully control the pulse of human desire. Yes, they tried, by labelling pretty much every fun sexual act as a sin, by demanding confession after even marital sex, and by warning that too much passion could summon demons. Yes, actual demons, with horns and everything. But behind closed doors, or more often slightly ajar wooden ones, life continued. Love letters were slipped beneath doors. glances lingered across feasting tables. And sometimes, when the fire crackled low and everyone else was asleep, something more might happen, even if the hay poked in all the wrong places. There's also the cold truth that power was a major factor in medieval sexuality. Lords had control over servants, knights over peasant women, and marriages could be arranged at terrifyingly young ages. It wasn't a world of consent as we understand it today. But it was also a world full of contradictions. Bawdy songs at festivals, public dances that were practically grinding, and carnivals where everything goes was almost the rule. So, as you sit there beneath your clean duvet, possibly within reach of 2 pillows and a phone that no one else has access to, remember this. Medieval castle life was loud, crowded, smelly, and incredibly human. The myths, chastity belts, noble passion, damsels sighing into silk sheets, those were mostly written later by people who either wanted to romanticize the past or laugh at it. The truth, far weirder, far messier, and somehow more real. Next up, we're going to peek behind some of those not-so-private chamber doors and see how a castle's architecture shaped the way people got busy, or, more often, didn't. So, let's slide deeper into the castle now. Not the tower or the banquet hall, but those inner rooms where the real human drama unfolded. You'd think sex in a medieval castle happened behind thick wooden doors with big iron locks and maybe a tapestry or two flapping gently in the breeze. Nope. What you're imagining is Victorian. A medieval castle is more like a giant stone echo chamber, where secrets are hard to keep, and walls aren't exactly known for their soundproofing. Picture this. You step into the Lord and Lady's chamber. It's the biggest sleeping space in the castle, maybe even blessed with a fireplace that mostly keeps the chill off. There's a huge 4-poster bed in the centre, the mattress stuffed with straw and feathers, creaking under the weight of thick linen sheets and a few fleas. If the Lord is wealthy, the bed might have curtains, luxurious velvet or wool that can be drawn for a semblance of privacy. But even then, there are at least 2 servants sleeping in the same room, one by the fire, one on a pallet near the door. And guess what? They're listening. Servants were everywhere. You couldn't dress, undress, or roll over in bed without someone being nearby. That whole "do not disturb" vibe didn't exist. In fact, the presence of witnesses during intimate moments wasn't just tolerated, it was expected in many noble marriages. A nobleman might even call in a few trusted onlookers to confirm he and his bride had done the deed, especially if land, titles, or money were on the line. A failed consummation. That could lead to annulment, scandal, and potentially a war between families. Nothing kills the mood like your great-uncle watching from a wooden stool holding a candle. The architecture of castles didn't help. Thick stone walls meant the rooms were always cold, and any warmth had to be generated by bodies, or fire. Fireplaces were inefficient, drafty windows let in the wind, and insulation was not a thing. Because of this, people slept in clusters. Servants huddled in corners, kids bunked with parents. In winter, it wasn't uncommon to sleep fully dressed. Stockings, caps, even gloves, under heavy woolen blankets. Want to sneak off for a bit of romance? Good luck finding a place where the floor doesn't squeak or someone isn't already asleep in it. Now, castles were designed for defence, not comfort. That meant narrow hallways, high ceilings, echoing stairwells, and very little in the way of intimate corners. Any sounds, especially the squeaky rhythmic ones, tended to travel. You couldn't whisper without it bouncing down the corridor, and if someone was up to something after dark, well, by breakfast, the entire household probably knew. Gossip moved faster than plague fleas. Still, humans are nothing if not adaptable. Despite the lack of privacy, people found ways to carve out moments for themselves. Sometimes it was in the guardrobe, the medieval toilet, which yes, doubled as a secret meeting spot. Other times, a couple might sneak up to the battlements or into the kitchen after hours. Even the chapel, solemn as it was, wasn't off limits for a stolen kiss. Just don't get caught. You didn't want to explain to a priest why there were muddy footprints leading to the altar. Here's a fun fact. Many medieval beds were actually built to accommodate more than just 2 people. Family beds could be wide enough to fit several siblings, a visiting cousin, and even a dog or 2. These weren't romantic spaces, they were practical heat-sharing machines. So if you were lucky enough to have a bed to yourself, or just you and your chosen partner, it was probably because you were filthy rich or someone had died recently. There was also a kind of low-level surveillance going on in most castles. Noble households were political environments where alliances were everything, and a slip in sexual decorum could mean disaster. Ladies-in-waiting kept an eye on noble women, reporting any flirtation or suspicious behaviour. Stewards and butlers often knew who was sneaking into whose chamber at night, and sometimes they even encouraged it. If a nobleman needed an heir, the pressure to produce one could turn a cold marriage into a carefully managed production. But what about the commoners, you ask? The maids, squires, and lower-ranking knights. Their experiences were no more private. If anything, they were more exposed. Servants often slept in large groups on haymats in side halls or storage rooms. Romances bloomed under blankets or behind barrels in the cellar. It was noisy, cramped, and incredibly unglamorous. But love, or at least lust, still found a way. And here's your quirky historical twist. In some castles, there were actually designated courting spaces, like small alcoves off the main hall where couples could talk semi-privately. These weren't love nests. They were more like awkward interview booths, but they allowed for semi-sanctioned flirtation. Picture a shy nobleman trying to impress a lady with tales of his falconry skills, while her chaperone lurks just a few feet away, pretending to be very interested in a tapestry. Now, historians do debate one juicy topic. Were secret tunnels in castles actually used for romantic trysts? While some castles had hidden staircases and passageways, designed more for escape during sieges than sneaking off with the cook's daughter, it's tempting to imagine these dim, narrow corridors hosting late-night rendezvous. Some say yes, some say it's pure fantasy. One French castle even has a legend about a knight who built an entire hidden corridor, so he could visit a lady without crossing the main courtyard, but no solid proof, just enough smoke to suggest a little fire. Ultimately, medieval castle life was a lesson in adaptation. You learned to make your moves quietly, to work within the rhythm of the household, and to rely on quick glances and stolen moments instead of grand gestures. There was no romantic soundtrack, no scented candles, no locking the door behind you, just stone, straw, and a whole lot of improvisation. Next time, we're diving into the deeply unromantic world of medieval marriage arrangements, and trust me, nothing screams passion like your dowry being measured in goats and linen. You're back in the castle, and this time, the fire's low, the draft is extra moody, and you're about to witness something even more chilling than a haunted suit of armour, a marriage negotiation. Yep, forget star-crossed lovers. In the medieval world, the real magic words were land transfer, dowry, and political alliance. Love? That came somewhere between securing an heir and making sure your livestock didn't die of foot rot. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't really about two hearts fluttering toward each other. It was a business deal, plain and simple. Families arranged unions for power, property, and preservation of noble bloodlines. The couple getting married, they usually had about as much say as the family's prized cow. If you were the daughter of a nobleman, your wedding might be negotiated when you were still learning to walk. And once the ink was dry on the parchment, that was that. You were spoken for. Let's say you're a young noblewoman, we'll call you Isolde, and your father's got a moderately impressive castle, some grain-producing land and a couple of peacocks. His eyes are on a nearby lord whose family owns better farmland but fewer military allies. Perfect match, right? So what if the lord's son, your future husband, is 12 years older than you and has a suspicious mole shaped like the Holy Roman Empire? You'll meet him once, maybe twice before the wedding. Hope you like beats and silence. Now, if you're a nobleman, your job is to get married early, sire sons fast, and preferably not die in a tournament. You're looking for a wife with good connections and a hefty dowry. Land, money, clothes, or sometimes even livestock. Yes, goats. Goats could clinch a marriage deal. If the dowry was rich enough, the bride didn't even have to be attractive, or, conscious of the whole situation. And here's the thing. There were actual brokers for these matches. Professional matchmakers. Think medieval Tinder, except it's your aunt. A quill, and no swipe left option. These brokers were trusted advisors, often clergy or nobles themselves, who knew everyone's business and weren't above a little exaggeration. Oh yes, Lord Dunrick's daughter is very fertile. Translation. She's had rashes, but nothing contagious. The marriage contract was a serious legal document, signed by both families, often sealed in front of witnesses and sometimes the church. It laid out everything from property rights to the handling of future disputes. In fact, it was so binding that even the Pope couldn't always annul it, unless, of course, a lot of money was involved. There were escape clauses, but they were rare. If either party turned out to be too closely related, yes, this happened a lot, the marriage could be called off. But even then, only after it caused massive social awkwardness and possibly war. And the wedding, not what you think. Lavish, yes. Full of joy, debatable. The ceremony was as much about the families uniting as the couple. You'd be married in the church, possibly in Latin, with a priest rattling off blessings while a bored noble tried to stay awake in the front pew. Then came the bedding. Yep, the guests would escort the couple to their room, often with crude jokes, drinks and songs, and sometimes they'd even stick around long enough to make sure the new couple got down to business. Nothing like having your aunt hand you a goblet while suggesting ways to encourage fertility. You might think that once married, the couple had at least a shot at building affection. Sometimes they did. There are records of noble couples who grew fond of each other, even affectionate. But more often, it was a cold alliance. The husband had mistresses. The wife managed the estate. They met in the night to produce children, then went back to their separate interests. And if one of them died, the surviving spouse remarried almost immediately, not out of heartbreak, but necessity. And it wasn't just the nobles. Peasants had their own marriage customs, and while love played a slightly larger role, the economics was still front and centre. A peasant father wanted his daughter to marry a man who could keep her fed, not one who made her giggle. The church eventually started regulating peasant marriages too, declaring that a couple could wed with mutual consent, even without parental approval. This didn't sit well with parents, who wanted some say in where their daughters ended up, preferably not in the next village with that creepy shepherd who talks to his goats. There's a surprisingly modern debate among scholars about how much freedom women really had in choosing spouses. Some believe noble women were entirely at the mercy of their fathers. Others argue that some savvy daughters, especially widows or heiresses, used influence and clever alliances to sway decisions. Evidence exists of women writing letters pleading for or against a marriage match. In one case, a woman flat out refused to marry the man chosen for her, escaped the estate, and married someone else. The scandal was massive. The outcome? She kept the husband and gained a reputation for being spirited, code for terrifyingly independent. Oh, and let's talk about age. Brace yourself. Medieval brides were often between 12 and 16 years, old when they married. Grooms could be anywhere from teenagers to old men in need of heirs before they died. The church technically said you could marry at age 7, though you couldn't consummate until puberty. Let that sink in. The logic was, start young, secure the alliance, and figure out the rest later. Love was for troubadours and foolish poets. Marriage was for survival. One of the strangest courtship traditions, trial marriages. In parts of medieval Europe, couples would live together for a year before deciding to tie the knot officially. The church hated this, obviously, but it happened. In fact, some considered a mutual promise followed by sex to be a valid marriage, no priest required. This grey area led to messy legal disputes and sudden claims of, but we were already married last spring behind the barn. So yeah, beneath the fluttering banners and wedding feasts, medieval marriage was more practical than passionate, more about power than partnership. And while some couples managed to forge connection or even genuine affection, the system wasn't built for romance. It was built for lineage, leverage, and land grabs. Up next, we're walking into the confessional, because the church had opinions about what you did in the dark, and let's just say they were very detailed and extremely judgmental. Alright, so now you're married, probably too young to someone you've barely spoken to, in a deal that was negotiated like a trade agreement, and now it's time to get on with the business of marital duties. But not so fast. Before you so much as think about getting frisky in that drafty four-poster bed, you'd better consider one important party who was definitely not invited to the honeymoon. The church. Yes, the Catholic Church was the ultimate third wheel in every medieval bedroom. From the 5th century all the way through the end of the Middle Ages, it held an iron grip on what was morally acceptable in the world of sex, and spoiler alert, very little of it was. Forget experimentation, spontaneity, or even enthusiasm. According to church doctrine, sex had one purpose: procreation. Everything else was a slippery slope to damnation, probably with fire, demons, and eternal regret. Let's say it's your wedding night. You lie down next to your new spouse, nerves jangling, maybe a little wine in your system. You pull back the blanket and hold up. Have you confessed your sins lately? Because according to many priests, entering the act with a lustful heart, or with too much enjoyment, could jeopardize your soul. That's right. Even married sex was suspect if it wasn't sufficiently solemn and purpose-driven. Imagine trying to be intimate while picturing St. Augustine judging you from the corner. The church published long lists, very long lists, of what was considered sinful in the bedroom. These weren't vague, be good statements. We're talking detailed, step-by-step prohibitions. Certain positions were frowned upon, too much noise, questionable, daytime sex, risky, sex during Lent, Advent, or on Sundays, flat-out number pregnancy, menstruation, or illness. Better hold off. Essentially, if the calendar didn't say sex allowed, you were supposed to abstain. Some scholars estimate there were fewer than 100 permissible days in the year, out of 365. So if you were really following the rules, you were basically a monk with a ring on. Now, that didn't mean people actually followed all this to the letter. There's a vast gulf between doctrine and practice. But the fear was real. A lot of medieval Christians carried guilt about sex, even within marriage. Confession became the place where people unloaded their sins of the flesh. Priests often grilled penitents on the specifics. How often, in what way, with what intentions. It got uncomfortably personal. Picture whispering your sexual routine to a celibate man with a notebook. Romantic, huh? And it gets weirder. Some theologians believed that demons could be summoned during particularly lustful acts, especially if they involved unnatural behaviour. These demons, called incubi and succubi, were said to prey on humans in their sleep, seducing them and stealing their energy, or worse, their souls. So if you had a particularly vivid dream one night, you might wake up wondering if you'd been visited by a sex demon. The line between sin and supernatural was paper thin. But not everyone was all fire and brimstone. There were fringe thinkers, yes, even among clergy, who wrote surprisingly progressive treatises on sex. Some even acknowledged pleasure as a gift from God when enjoyed within marriage, and in rare cases married couples with strong emotional bonds were celebrated. Still, these were the exceptions. The general tone was, sex is necessary but deeply suspicious. Like using a medieval chamber pot, you do it because you must, not because you're thrilled about it. A popular medieval guide for confessors, the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, went deep into these issues. Aquinas was the guy who argued that even laughter during sex was problematic, because it showed too much delight. Fun fact, Aquinas also had a theory that women were biologically inferior because they were the result of weak sperm. So yeah, not exactly a sex-positive icon. But beyond the church's official stance, there were local customs and traditions that softened the edges. In some rural areas, fertility festivals still took place, with ancient pagan rituals thinly disguised as Christian celebrations. May Day, for example, often involved young people disappearing into the woods together, returning looking, well, rather pleased with themselves. The church tried to crack down on these events, but culture has a way of surviving repression. What's also fascinating is that people developed coded language to talk about sex. Courtly poetry, ballads, and even religious texts used metaphor and symbolism to describe desire. A knight's sword became a pretty obvious symbol. A lady's garden didn't need much translation. This was how people expressed sexuality without triggering the wrath of the local priest, or at least not openly. If you knew how to read between the lines, medieval literature was often sizzling. Of course, all this spiritual policing didn't apply equally. Men had more wiggle room, especially powerful men. Kings and lords had mistresses, fathered illegitimate children, and still received communion on Sundays. For women, though, the standard was harsh. A married woman who cheated could be divorced, punished, even executed in extreme cases. A man, he might get a slap on the wrist or a stern talking to from his confessor. Sound fair? Of course not. Welcome to medieval morality. There's still scholarly debate about how deeply church teachings shaped people's actual behaviour. Some historians argue that rural folks mostly ignored the fire and brimstone messaging, living according to older, earthier traditions. Others say the church's influence was massive, permeating everything from family planning to bedroom design, those separate twin beds, a nod to moral purity. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. People internalised the rules they feared most, and bent the ones they thought they could get away with. And let's not forget, the clergy itself wasn't exactly celibate in practice. Plenty of monks and priests had housekeepers who mysteriously became pregnant. Entire towns knew about Father Bertrand's mistress, but looked the other way until the bishop showed up. The church tried to reform this over and over again, but libido doesn't read policy manuals. So now imagine you're lying in that cold, candlelit bedroom, trying to remember if it's a sin to enjoy your spouse's touch. You're doing mental math on the liturgical calendar, the moon phase, and whether this counts as lustful intent. Meanwhile, your partner just wants to pull the covers up and pretend the priest isn't lurking in the back of your head. Welcome to the reality of medieval intimacy under divine surveillance. Next time, we'll flip through some of the most scandalous how-to guides of the age. Yes, medieval people had sex manuals, and no, they weren't all written by monks with guilty consciences. Let's dim the torches and pull out something truly spicy from the medieval nightstand. Not a dagger, not a rosary, but a good old-fashioned sex manual. Yes, believe it or not, people in the Middle Ages wrote and read guides to pleasure. They weren't all cloistered in fear under the church's eye. Some folks had curiosity, desire, and just enough literacy to make things interesting. These manuals didn't exactly line castle bookshelves in neat leather-bound rows, but they existed, often copied by hand, traded in whispers, or hidden behind more respectable texts like herbal remedies and religious sermons. The most infamous of these early how-to books was the Trotula, a collection of medical writings attributed to a woman physician from Salerno in the 12th century. While much of it focuses on women's health and reproduction, it doesn't shy away from sexual advice. There are entire sections devoted to arousal, fertility, and even how to make sex more pleasurable for women. Shocking, right? One passage cheerily recommends applying stimulating oils to warm the womb and excite lust. That's a polite medieval way of saying foreplay matters. But perhaps the most eye-popping text came from later in the period, when translated Arabic works began circulating in Europe. Arab scholars like Avicenna and Averroes brought with them not only advanced medical knowledge, but detailed discussions of sexual health and enjoyment. These were often snuck into Europe under the guise of scientific inquiry. Once in Latin, they found their way into the hands of adventurous readers, noblemen, scholars, even some forward-thinking clergy. One such work, The Perfumed Garden, originally from the Islamic world but eventually whispered about in Europe, dives into positions, emotional connection, and even the importance of mutual satisfaction. In some parts, it reads more like a tantric guide than a stiff academic text. And while it wasn't exactly bedtime reading for your average serf, in the libraries of the educated elite, these texts were treated like a mix of sacred wisdom and forbidden fruit. But the real twist? Many of these works were read not just for pleasure, but for practical reasons. Medieval people didn't separate sex from medicine or magic the way we do today. They believed sexual function, or dysfunction, was directly tied to bodily health, humours, and even astrology. A man who couldn't perform might be diagnosed with cold humours and given warming foods, massages, or creative applications of herbs. Women who lacked desire were thought to suffer from a dry womb, or wandering uterus. The solution? Stimulate it, of course. With what exactly? Use your imagination. They certainly did. And then there were the illustrations. Oh yes, a few copies came complete with drawings, clumsy, hilarious, and wildly inaccurate by modern standards. One marginal doodle shows a man with a, let's say, generous endowment straddling a woman in what looks like a very confused wheelbarrow. Another shows lovers entwined beneath a tree, surrounded by musical instruments and suggestively shaped fruits. Think medieval Kama Sutra meets doodles by someone who's only seen horses mate. These images weren't just for kicks. Scholars debate their intent. Were they educational, titillating, or cautionary? Some say they were included to help explain difficult positions. Others think they were visual metaphors for fertility and spiritual unity. And some were likely added later by bored scribes with too much ink and not enough adult supervision. You can practically hear Brother Geoffrey snickering as he draws a couple entwined in the margins of psalms. But not all sex advice was serious. There were humorous texts too, bawdy poems, ribald tales, and love songs that doubled as seduction guides. A popular genre was the fablio, short comic tales often centred around cheating spouses, mischievous monks, and clever lovers. One tale features a man hiding in a flour barrel to catch his cheating wife, only to be baked into a pie. Another has a woman teaching her friend how to moan convincingly so her husband believes she's satisfied. So yes, medieval people told dirty jokes, and they were weirdly specific. Even the church got in on the action, albeit unintentionally. Some theological texts include detailed lists of sexual sins, not to educate you on how, but on what not to do. The result: curious minds read between the lines. A confessor's handbook might warn against intercrural intimacy or rearward unions, which for a lot of readers was their first time hearing these things were even options. It's like being handed an ancient version of a kink checklist, only with more judgment and Latin. Now here's a quirky tidbit. In a few regions, sex education was actually part of premarital counselling. Before the wedding, a priest or older family member would explain the mechanics to the couple, sometimes with metaphor, sometimes with startling directness. One recorded session involved a mother using bread dough to demonstrate how her daughter's body would change after intercourse. That's not a euphemism. She actually shaped the dough and said, "You'll be like this." Thank you, Mum. All this goes to show that medieval people, while constrained by religion and social norms, weren't clueless. They asked questions, they experimented, they wrote things down. Sure, the majority of the population was illiterate, but word of the mouth carried knowledge, and illustrations helped bridge the gap. And even if the church frowned on it, humans found ways to pass on what mattered, whether through poetry, herbal remedies, or hilarious stained glass windows depicting a farmer spanking a nun. Yes, that exists. And yet, scholars still argue over how widespread this knowledge really was. Were these sex manuals common, or elite only? Did peasants hear about them through gossip, or were they completely in the dark? Some evidence suggests that folk remedies, like aphrodisiac potions and fertility charms, were more common than formal guides. Others believe there was a surprising amount of openness in medieval sexual culture, masked by the heavy veneer of piety. The truth likely varies from region to region, from dusty Spanish castles to muddy Saxon huts. So the next time someone tells you medieval people were oppressed and prudish, remind them that somewhere in a dusty monastery, a half-blind scribe once giggled while sketching a naked couple under a pear tree, and that someone else probably paid good money to read about it. Next, we'll slide into the sheets, literally, and explore why medieval people shared beds like it was a team sport, and how this cosy, or not so cosy, sleeping culture shaped intimacy in the most unexpected ways. Alright, now that we've paged through the sex manuals and giggled at some truly chaotic illustrations, let's talk about where all this supposed action was actually happening. No, not secret garden alcoves or candlelit love nests. We're talking about beds. Big, wide, communal medieval beds. And if you're picturing a cosy private mattress made for two under the soft glow of torchlight, please toss that fantasy out the window and prepare yourself for something closer to an overnight campout in a barn. In medieval castles, beds were many things. Expensive, practical, and surprisingly crowded. First off, if you had a bed at all, you were already ahead of the game. Most people, especially peasants or low-level servants, slept on straw mats, sacks stuffed with chaff, or just plain wood benches covered in whatever animal skin they could scrounge. If you were high-ranking or lucky enough to sleep in the Lord's manor, you might get a frame with ropes crisscrossed to support a thick mattress of feathers and hay. And by mattress, I mean a lumpy, scratchy pile of potential pest activity that you'd beat nightly in the hopes of not waking up with mysterious bites. But here's the kicker. You didn't sleep alone, not even close. Beds were communal, shared by family members, servants, visiting travellers, and sometimes even strangers. It wasn't scandalous. It was economical. Fireplaces could only heat so much space, so bodies provided insulation. A single bed might sleep a married couple, their children, a maid, and maybe even a hunting hound curled at the foot. It was less do not disturb and more hope no one snores. And if you were of noble birth, yes, you had a bit more privacy. Sort of. Nobles had their own chambers, often shared only with close household staff. But remember, those chambers weren't sealed sanctuaries. Curtains might enclose the bed. Fancy, heavy ones made of wool or velvet. But those were more for warmth than privacy. Sounds still travelled. Smells definitely did. And if something romantic was going on behind those curtains, the rustling would let the entire room know it. There are historical records of guests being invited to sleep in a lord's chamber, even in the bed itself. That wasn't seen as odd. It was a sign of hospitality. Some travellers wrote in their journals about being offered a spot beside their host and his wife for the night, as if it were a perfectly reasonable arrangement, which, for them, it was. So, yes, you could be curled up with your own spouse, only to realise someone else's cold toes were finding your leg in the dark. Sweet dreams. This culture of shared sleeping extended far beyond the castle. In inns, travellers, bunked together in great rooms with thin partitions or none at all. In peasant cottages, entire families slept on one pallet. If a newborn came into the picture, congratulations, make space on the edge. And when sickness struck, the bed became a hub of nursing, praying, eating, and eventually dying. It wasn't just a place for sleep, it was the central platform of domestic life. Births and deaths happened there. So did negotiations, arguments, and occasionally attempts at romance. But let's say you were in a relationship and wanted a moment of actual intimacy. You might try to sneak into your partner's bed under the cover of darkness. This practice, called bundling in later periods, had early versions in the Middle Ages. In some areas, couples would lie together fully clothed, sometimes with a board between them, to talk, snuggle, and get to know one another before marriage. The logic? You could touch, maybe kiss, but anything more would anger God, your parents, and possibly a few livestock spirits. Of course, the success rate of those boards staying between bodies was, let's say, inconsistent. One quirky historical account comes from 14th century Wales, where bundling was practised with surprisingly open acceptance. Families would invite the prospective groom to spend the night in their daughter's bed, usually under some sort of supervision or very optimistic trust in the couple's restraint. While not technically medieval mainstream, these kinds of customs remind us that sleeping arrangements weren't rigidly prudish. They were just very, very communal. And here's something historians love to argue about. Did all this bed sharing lead to more casual sex, or did the lack of privacy actually discourage it? On one hand, constant surveillance and physical proximity meant fewer chances to sneak off. On the other hand, when everyone's doing it and boundaries are already blurry, slipping under the blanket next to someone might not seem that scandalous. Some scholars say the shared bed was a space of opportunity. Others insist it was more awkward than erotic. The jury's still out, but based on some preserved love letters, we can safely say at least a few people found ways to make it work. And let's not forget about the ceremonial aspect of bedding. In noble marriages, the first night wasn't just expected, it was sometimes observed. In certain traditions, witnesses would lead the newlyweds to bed with songs, drink, and light-hearted jabs, then stick around to watch the couple climb in together. In extreme cases, a priest or noble family member would stay long enough to confirm consummation, which was usually judged by sounds, visible affection, or, yes, brace yourself, the production of stained bed linens the next morning. Those linens were sometimes displayed publicly. Nothing says romance like your bedsheets being the talk of the village. Not surprisingly, this performative aspect made some couples dread the wedding night entirely. It wasn't just about intimacy, it was a test, a spectacle, and if the union had political implications, a matter of state. No pressure, right? Still, amidst the snores, farts and creaking ropes, some genuine connection did happen. Even in packed beds, couples found their rhythm. Maybe they learned to whisper in the quiet moments. Maybe they waited until the rest of the room was asleep and the fire had burned low. Maybe they laughed when someone rolled over and knocked a candlestick to the floor. It was messy and inconvenient, sure, but sometimes it was real. So next time you sprawl across your memory foam mattress in a quiet, climate-controlled bedroom, just remember that for most of history, sleep was a group activity. And if you wanted a moment of passion, you probably had to earn it by sharing the mattress with someone's cousin, a wet dog, and a half-eaten turnip. Next up, we're diving into the medieval obsession with virginity, how it was measured, why it was terrifyingly important, and what bizarre lengths people went to in order to prove it. So you've survived the crowded bed, the sleepover guests, the judgmental priest, and now you're staring down what may be the most intense part of the whole medieval sexual experience: virginity. Not the idea of it, not the symbolism, but the all-consuming, socially pressurized, deeply misunderstood obsession with the condition of a woman's body before marriage. It wasn't just a matter of pride, it was property verification, like checking for hail damage on a new horse. In the medieval world, virginity wasn't just a personal matter, it was public business. Particularly for noble women, it functioned as proof of value, virtue, and legitimacy. If a woman was to marry into a powerful family, her sexual purity was non-negotiable. Entire alliances, inheritances, and reputations hinged on that one intimate, deeply misunderstood concept. People didn't just want a virgin bride, they needed one. The stakes were enormous, and that pressure, it was entirely one-sided. Let's be clear, nobody was triple-checking whether the groom had kept his breeches zipped until the wedding night. Male virginity, if it was discussed at all, was a laughable curiosity. But for women, particularly those from noble families, it was a matter of honour, both personal and familial. The daughter's body was her family's investment, and anything less than untouched could mean social catastrophe. Not exactly a relaxing start to married life. So how did they know if a woman was a virgin? That's where things get sketchy, like medieval gynecology meets superstition, and outright fantasy, sketchy. One of the most enduring beliefs was that the hymen served as proof, a kind of anatomical seal of approval. If it was broken, she clearly wasn't pure. But here's the fun and unfortunate twist. They didn't actually understand how it worked. Even today, the idea that the hymen can always be used to determine virginity is a myth. Back then, they thought it was a magic membrane that snapped like a twig at the moment of first penetration. No pressure, right? So the proof often came down to blood. Specifically, blood on the sheets after the wedding night. That's why, in some noble households, those sheets were collected and displayed the next morning, like a horrifying medieval version of Yelp reviews. No blood, whispers started, rumours spread. A bride could find herself shamed, divorced, or worse. Never mind that not every woman bleeds during sex, and that many other factors could affect whether anything showed up on the linen. If the cloth didn't confirm her purity, the consequences could be brutal. Some families went further. There were actual terrifying virginity tests. Midwives or trusted female relatives would perform physical inspections of the bride before the wedding. That's right, a premarital checkup without the consent or understanding we demand today. The process was invasive, humiliating, and pseudo-scientific. In some cases, these women would declare a bride intact or spoiled based on, well, vibes and guesswork mostly. And if a bride wasn't a virgin, panic mode. For noble women, this could mean annulment, disinheritance, or forced entry into a convent. In more extreme cases, accusations of fornication could lead to public punishment, exile, or execution. You read that right. A woman's life could literally depend on something as fragile and medically unreliable as a piece of tissue. Some desperate families even tried to fake it, dabbing animal blood on sheets, staging awkward reenactments, or outright lying. The stakes were too high to trust nature. Now, virginity wasn't just about sex. It was tied up with spiritual ideals too. The church revered virginity, especially female virginity, as a holy state. Virgin martyrs were venerated. The Virgin Mary became the ultimate symbol of purity, obedience, and sacred femininity. Every good Christian woman was supposed to aspire to be like her, even if she also had to become a wife and mother. So yeah, no pressure again. The church taught that virginity was the highest spiritual state for a woman. Even marriage, the so-called acceptable outlet for sexual activity, was considered a step down from lifelong chastity. Monks and priests preached about the decay of the female body after sex, as if each encounter stripped a woman of her holiness layer by layer. There were entire sermons dedicated to the virtue of a sealed womb, and for women who chose celibacy, nuns, anchorites, or spiritual mystics, there was a kind of mystical status, like they'd unlocked a bonus level of heavenly approval. Here's your quirky side note. There are records of women who faked their own virginity, after a rather robust sexual history, by claiming miraculous restoration. Some saints were said to have regrown their virginity through prayer. No, really. A few medieval hagiographies describe divine intervention literally patching things up below the waist, so the holy woman could die a virgin in the eyes of God. Skeptical, so were a few medieval doctors. But to the faithful, these stories were inspirational, if not entirely reassuring. Of course, not every woman submitted quietly. Some rebelled against the virginity cult in subtle ways. Courtly love poetry gave voice to women with desires, preferences, and even regrets. In certain noble circles it became a kind of open secret that a few liaisons happened before marriage, as long as discretion was maintained. There were even cases where premarital sex was overlooked if the union was politically useful. Hypocrisy, absolutely. But also a reminder that medieval life was full of contradictions. Modern scholars debate how deeply this virginity obsession penetrated the everyday lives of ordinary women. For peasants, the rules were looser. A farmer's daughter might have more leeway, especially in communities where betrothal was considered semi-binding. If a couple had sex after exchanging vows, even before the official wedding, they might still be regarded as married in the eyes of the village. That didn't mean it was a free-for-all, though. Reputation mattered, even in the fields. A woman seen as loose could lose marriage prospects, social standing and protection. The price was lower than in the castle, but it still cost something. And here's the thing. For all the focus on virginity, very little was said about female pleasure. The ideal virgin wasn't just untouched. She was supposed to be passive, obedient, and barely aware of what sex even was. The perfect bride walked into her wedding night with holy terror, offered herself like a lamb at the altar, and emerged changed, but not too vocal about it. Anything more enthusiastic might raise suspicions, and women who knew too much, they were labelled dangerous, or worse, witches. But that's another tale coming later. So here you are, a young noblewoman in a freezing castle, with your value judged not by your mind or your kindness, but by whether you bled on cue. The candles are lit, the servants are lurking, your new husband looks awkward, and your aunt is probably outside with a towel. Sleep tight. Next time, we're taking a detour into romance, the sugary, sighing, poetry-drenched world of courtly love. But don't be fooled. Beneath the roses and rhyming couplets, it's all about control, manipulation, and a surprising amount of emotional constipation. So now you're married, perhaps traumatised by your public virginity reveal, and desperately hoping for a little tenderness. Enter stage left, the ever-dramatic, sigh-heavy, ridiculously overthought world of courtly love. You've seen the paintings, knights kneeling before ladies, offering roses with the kind of intensity that suggests they've never spoken to a woman before. Maybe you've read the poems, endless verses about radiant eyes, distant longing and unbearable ache. But here's the truth nobody tells you. Courtly love was basically emotional cosplay. Flirtation under strict rules, a polite social lie wrapped in silken sonnets. Courtly love wasn't about actual relationships, it was a game. Think medieval emotional roleplay for the bored and elite, born out of the chivalric traditions of 12th century France and popularised by troubadours and poets. Courtly love was usually an affair of longing between a knight and a noblewoman. The key detail? She was almost always married. That's right, he was writing poems to someone else's wife. But it was okay, because it was spiritual love, elevated desire, totally not about getting physical. Except, yeah, sometimes it was. Imagine it. You're a lady of the court. Your husband is off fighting in some minor war or trying to track down that one particularly fast deer. You're stuck in the castle with embroidery, psalms and passive-aggressive glances from your mother-in-law. And then, bam! A knight starts composing poems about your hair, your grace, your ability to walk down a corridor without tripping. He challenges another knight to a tournament in your name. He pledges to wear your colours. Maybe he even writes a song about the way you looked at him once when the soup was too salty. You swoon, or at least pretend to, and that's the point. It's all a performance. Courtly love was designed to be both passionate and chaste. A woman could flirt outrageously through poetry, while still maintaining the image of a perfect, untouchable lady. A man could express deep devotion without ever touching the object of his affection. There were rules to this game. The woman always held the upper hand. The man had to earn her favour through suffering, patience, and poetic torment. If he was lucky, she might give him a glove or a secret smile, maybe a lock of hair, maybe nothing at all. But don't confuse this with actual romance. These love poems were usually more about status than love. A noble woman who had a knight pining after her was considered desirable, even more so if she never gave in. And for the knight, declaring love for a married noblewoman was safer than chasing a single girl. It was all very strategic. If a knight went after an unmarried woman, he risked stirring real scandal. But a married lady? As long as it stayed poetic, no harm done. Sort of like the medieval version of crushing on your boss's wife. but keeping it to interpretive dance. Of course, sometimes the fantasy spilled over into real life. There are plenty of tales, some fact, some folklore, of knights who did get involved with their ladies. Affairs happened, especially when husbands were absent or distracted, but the actual risk was enormous. Getting caught meant disgrace, exile, or execution. So most of the time, the love stayed safely confined to parchment and awkward eye contact during Mass. Let's not forget the literary goldmine this culture produced. Entire romances were built on these ideals. Think of Lancelot and Guinevere, one of the most famous examples of courtly love gone very, very wrong. Their story, as told in countless versions, begins with restraint, longing, and noble sacrifice, until it crashes into full-blown adultery and helps destroy the Round Table. Other tales, like Tristan and Isolde or the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, gave medieval audiences endless variations on the same theme: love as torment, love as worship, love as delayed gratification. South much delay. These stories weren't written for peasants. This was the fantasy life of the literate elite, nobles who could afford to pretend they were in emotional agony over a woman they weren't allowed to touch. But the cultural effect trickled down. Even among lower classes, the idea of idealised romance started to take hold. Songs, ballads, and folk tales borrowed courtly motifs. The idea of wooing, winning a woman's heart through gestures and persistence, took root, and with it came the assumption that women should be won, like castle sieges with nicer metaphors. Here's a weird historical wrinkle. Some courtly love rules were codified, as in someone actually wrote them down. Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century French cleric, penned The Art of Courtly Love, a bizarre blend of advice, satire, and romantic absurdity. He lays out 31 rules, including gems like marriage is no excuse for not loving, and a true lover is always trembling. Honestly, the guy sounds like he was 5 poems away from becoming a full-blown incel. Historians still debate whether Capellanus was being serious. Was he earnestly trying to explain how nobles should conduct themselves in love, or was he mocking the whole scene, laughing at nobles too emotionally constipated to say what they really wanted? It's hard to say. The line between satire and sincerity was as blurry then as it is now. And what about the women? Did they actually enjoy this attention? Some probably did. Having a man pledge eternal devotion without expecting physical intimacy might have felt empowering. Others surely found it tedious or performative. Some women, especially queens and powerful noblewomen, played the game like chess masters, knowing exactly how much to give, how much to hold back, and when to use their suitor's devotion to their political advantage. Love, after all, was currency, and a man in love was a man easily manipulated. There are letters from the period that show noblewomen responding to courtly declarations with wit, sarcasm, or gentle dismissal. One lady, clearly over it, wrote back to a knight's lengthy love poem with a brief note: "Your heart is yours, keep it." That's the medieval version of ghosting. Still, courtly love left its mark. It shaped the way Europe thought about romance for centuries. It elevated longing over lust, idealization over reality, and suffering over satisfaction. Even today, echoes of it linger in rom-coms, tragic love stories, and the persistent myth that love means always waiting, always aching, always earning someone's affection through trial and torment. So here you are, stuck in a castle, married off in a cold transaction, and now the guy who lives 2 towers over is writing odes about the way your hair glints in candlelight. You want affection, you want connection. But what you're getting is verses, metaphors, and the occasional embroidered kerchief. Cute, but not exactly fulfilling. Next, we'll shift our gaze to someone always watching from the edge of the chamber, the lady's maid. Because behind every noblewoman fluttering a fan is someone holding a bucket, carrying secrets, and probably rolling her eyes the entire time. Now, let's stop focusing on the shining knight, or the sighing lady, and instead swivel the candlelight toward the quiet figure in the background, the one holding the wash basin, arranging the bed linens, and pretending not to hear a single moan or complaint. Say hello to the lady's maid, or the chambermaid, or the nursemaid, or the personal servant who did pretty much everything except wear the dress she spent half her life lacing up. In the shadowy social labyrinth of the medieval castle, this woman saw and heard everything. And if there was anyone with the keys to the real sexual drama of the household, it was her. Being a maid to a noblewoman was a job that sat right at the intersection of privilege and servitude. You had proximity to wealth, access to secrets, and a front row seat to every whispered conversation, exchanged letter, and unfortunate rash. But you also worked brutally long hours, had no personal privacy, and were expected to blend into the stonework whenever something delicate was going on, like a marriage, or a flirtation, or a full-blown scandal unfolding 2 feet away from your mop bucket. Let's imagine you're a chambermaid in a wealthy castle. You're probably the daughter of a lower-ranked noble family or a well-connected servant. You've been trained to sew, clean, bathe your mistress, manage her clothing, and help her prepare for bed. Which, by the way, included removing her girdle, unlacing her chemise, oiling her hair, and maybe even helping her into the bed she shared with her husband, and possibly you if space was tight. You were trusted to keep your mouth shut, your eyes down, and your ears open for only the things your mistress wanted you to hear. But here's the thing. While everyone pretended the lady's maid was invisible, she knew she wasn't. She was the one passing notes between lovers. She was the one arranging midnight meetings behind the chapel. She was the one holding the door when a certain knight left the chamber in a rush, shirt misbuttoned and face flushed. If the lady of the house was involved in a flirtation, the maid knew. If she was trying to hide a pregnancy, the maid was the one boiling the herbs. And if there was trouble, real trouble, the maid was the one who got the mistress dressed fast and found a believable excuse before the steward barged in. And yet, for all this power, her position was incredibly vulnerable. If the mistress got caught, the maid could be blamed, accused of aiding in adultery, accused of spreading rumours, accused of not stopping something she may have had no real power to stop. Maids were often scapegoats. Noble women, even ones engaging in affairs, could protect themselves with family names and titles. A servant? Not so lucky. A fall from favour could mean exile from the household, a ruined reputation or worse, being punished as if you were the one doing the seducing. Let's also not pretend these women lived in a world of passive observation. Maids had desires too. They had secret relationships, sometimes with stable boys, sometimes with other maids, and occasionally with the noblemen they served. That last one? Complicated. A nobleman who seduced or coerced a maid didn't usually face consequences. The maid, however, could lose everything. Her job, her reputation, and if she became pregnant, her entire social standing. Some noble families tolerated these relationships as long as they remained quiet. Others sent the maid away the moment her belly started to swell. And yet, sometimes these relationships led to long-term arrangements. Some maids became unofficial concubines, or even married their lovers if the men were of lower noble rank. Others simply disappeared into convents, or married off to older men in far-off villages, their secrets tucked neatly away under veils and silence. There's a fascinating set of letters from the 15th century between a noblewoman and her former maid, in which the maid, now married to a merchant, reminds her former mistress that she once helped her out of a delicate situation involving a priest and a misplaced letter. The tone is casual, even affectionate, but the subtext is pure power play. I know what you did, and I kept your secrets. Let's remember that, shall we? Historians have long debated the exact role of servants in managing noble affairs. Were they passive, complicit, manipulative? The truth is probably all of the above. Some maids were fiercely loyal, bound by years of companionship. Others used what they knew as currency. Blackmail wasn't unheard of, especially in households where inheritance or social standing teetered on a knife's edge. A single whispered truth could change the course of a noble family's future. There are even cases of maids rising in status through their discretion and usefulness. One well-documented example is a maid who served the Queen of France and eventually became the king's unofficial advisor on court gossip. She knew who was sleeping with whom, who was hiding debts, and which alliances were fraying. Her network of whispered confessions made her indispensable until it made her dangerous. She was later accused of sorcery, not because she was practicing magic, but because powerful women without titles always got called witches eventually. Let's not forget the physical toll. Maids didn't just know everything, they did everything. They scrubbed blood from sheets after wedding nights. They mixed herbal brews for contraception or miscarriage. They helped deliver babies in secret. They applied poultices to infected wounds, both from battle and from diseases we now classify as sexually transmitted. And they did it all while maintaining the image of serene, silent support. You want a real picture of medieval sexual culture? Forget the jousting knights and blushing brides. Watch the maid sweeping ashes from the hearth at dawn while stepping over last night's scandal. She's seen it all. She's cleaned it all. And she's probably humming a ballad that sounds suspiciously like gossip put to melody. Some scholars suggest that the lady's maid was an early prototype of the modern confidant, a figure who stood just outside power but shaped it through proximity. In a world where women's lives were often dictated by male authority, the private, informal network between women, mistress and maid included, was its own kind of resistance. Secrets passed from woman to woman, generation to generation, sometimes helping to protect, sometimes helping to manipulate. So next time you picture a medieval castle, don't just imagine the noblewoman brushing her hair or the knight writing odes to her ankles. Picture the woman behind her, holding the brush, listening quietly, remembering every word and already planning how to handle the fallout when that poem accidentally ends up in the wrong hands. Next up, we're stepping into even murkier waters: medieval menstruation, fertility myths, and the many, many ways they thought the moon might control your womb. Let's shuffle out of the bedchamber now, carefully stepping over the maid, still pretending to be asleep in the corner, and head into one of the least discussed but most influential corners of medieval sexuality: the wild, misunderstood world of menstruation, fertility, and moon-based reproductive science. And if you're already bracing for bad medical advice, you're correct to do so. Because when it came to understanding women's bodies, medieval people brought a blend of folklore, religious anxiety, and just enough ancient Greek science to make it all wildly confusing and deeply unhelpful. Let's start with menstruation, referred to in polite company as the monthly flux, or the flowers. To be clear, nobody liked talking about it, but they had a lot of thoughts. According to prevailing medical theory at the time, especially the influential writings of Galen and Hippocrates, who were very dead but still treated like the final word, menstruation was the body's way of purging excess humours, basically draining off the bad stuff to keep a woman balanced. Blood wasn't just blood. It was a sign of inner equilibrium, or lack thereof. If you didn't menstruate properly, people believed you could become ill, emotionally unstable, or even start hallucinating. Some thought retained menstrual blood could cause suffocation of the womb. One remedy: leech therapy. Another: forced intercourse. Yep, that escalated quickly. You, as a woman in medieval Europe, weren't exactly encouraged to understand your own body. Menstrual cycles were observed, sure, but through a fog of misinformation and superstition. For example, it was widely believed that a menstruating woman could sour wine just by looking at it. She could cause bread not to rise. Milk would curdle in her presence. Bees would die. Crops might wither, all because you had a uterus on its monthly cleaning cycle. Some people wouldn't even let menstruating women attend church, fearing their impure aura would desecrate the altar. Because of course God is cool with holy wars and inquisitions, but he draws the line at tampons. So how did medieval women handle their periods? Not with pads, certainly. There were cloth rags, reusable and often shared among women in the same household or passed down like uncomfortable heirlooms. Some used moss or wool stuffed into linen pouches. Others just let it flow and wore dark underlayers to hide the evidence. Keep in mind, laundry was rare, water was cold, and soap was made out of lard and lies. If you bled through your clothes, it wasn't just embarrassing. It could spark rumours about demonic possession or marital neglect. And yes, there were women burned as witches for being unclean too often. So next time you complain about cramps, remember, it could be worse. It could be a public trial. Now let's talk fertility. If you were a woman in medieval Europe, your entire worth was often tied to your ability to produce children, preferably male. People didn't understand eggs or ovulation, but they definitely had theories. One widely held belief was that conception required simultaneous orgasm. That's right. Pleasure wasn't just allowed, it was medically required for pregnancy. According to this theory, if a woman didn't climax, no baby. While deeply flawed, this myth accidentally gave women a kind of leverage. No heir yet? Guess he needs to try harder. That said, failure to conceive almost always landed on the woman's shoulders. No one thought to check the husband's fertility. If a couple went years without children, the wife was assumed to be barren, cursed, or sinful. Remedies range from drinking potions made of boiled animal parts to wearing magical fertility amulets. Some women were advised to bathe in goat's milk. Others were told to hold pieces of iron under their pillows. One popular method involved sitting on a fertility stone at certain times of the year, naked and chanting. Was it effective? Probably not. But it got you out of the castle for a few minutes. Now let's add the moon into this hormonal soup. Medieval physicians believed that the moon had a direct influence on women's fertility cycles. Since the moon's phases loosely matched the menstrual cycle, the assumption was that it controlled everything from ovulation to childbirth. Midwives timed pregnancies with lunar charts. Herbalists prescribed conception during full moons for sons and new moons for daughters. The moon wasn't just a glowing rock, it was your reproductive project manager. Some believed that children born under different moon phases had distinct temperaments. A waxing moon might give you a clever baby, a waning one, a dullard. Full moon? Watch out. Probably a thief. The accuracy of these predictions remains unconfirmed, but the commitment to astrology as sexual science was real. One noblewoman reportedly refused to sleep with her husband unless the stars were properly aligned, much to his frustration and eventual infidelity. Astrology, in fact, played a major role in sexual and reproductive decision-making. Couples consulted astrologers before consummating a marriage. Birth charts were drawn to determine the best nights. Certain zodiac signs were seen as fertile. Hello, Cancer and Taurus. While others, like Virgo or Scorpio, were treated with suspicion. Yes, being a Scorpio was suspicious even back then. Some kings had court astrologers whose entire job was to tell them when to have sex. Imagine that. Your royal love-making calendar determined by a guy with a telescope and a bad beard. There were, of course, midwives, real women with practical experience and surprisingly advanced knowledge of female health. These midwives were the unsung heroes of medieval gynecology. They knew which herbs could help regulate cycles, ease pain, or even prevent pregnancy. More on that later. But they walked a razor's edge. Too much knowledge made them valuable and dangerous. The church distrusted them. Some were accused of witchcraft. Others were forced to hide their knowledge under the guise of prayer and piety. One wrong move, and they went from healer to heretic. Despite all this, women did find community in their shared experiences. Older women taught younger ones how to track cycles, manage pain, and avoid the worst of the stigma. Herbal baths, moon rituals, and whispered wisdom passed from generation to generation. It wasn't science as we know it, but it was survival. And sometimes it worked better than the official treatments handed down by cloistered men who had never seen a uterus in their lives. So picture this. You're standing under a full moon, clutching a bundle of herbs tied with red thread. Your stomach aches, your husband thinks you're cursed, the priest thinks you need confession, and your maid is muttering that maybe you should try garlic in your shoes. Welcome to medieval menstrual health. It's sacred, shameful, and soaked in superstition. Next time, we'll venture into the world of medieval hygiene, specifically what people did, or didn't do, to clean themselves before getting busy. Because believe it or not, they had bathhouses, body oils, and enough garlic breath to stun a horse. Let's light a few incense sticks, or maybe just throw a handful of lavender on a smouldering coal, because tonight we're entering a space many assume medieval folks avoided like the plague, and sometimes during the plague: hygiene. Specifically, the surprisingly nuanced, deeply misunderstood relationship between cleanliness and sex in the Middle Ages. If you think every romantic encounter took place between two unwashed, mud-smeared serfs who hadn't bathed since last Michaelmas, think again. The truth is messier, but also cleaner than you'd expect. First, we've got to tackle the myth that nobody bathed in the Middle Ages. It's one of those ideas that clings to history like mildew on a bathhouse wall, but it's only half true. In fact, during the earlier part of the medieval period, especially in cities and noble courts, bathing was not only common, it was a social event. Public bathhouses, many modelled on ancient Roman designs, could be found throughout medieval Europe. Think large, steamy rooms with wooden tubs, herbal infusions, and communal nudity under candlelight. Honestly, it sounds like a decent Friday night. But bathhouses weren't just for relaxing or washing off the castle stench. They were also places where flirtation, gossip, and yes, sex often happened. Mixed-gender bathhouses existed, especially in Germany and parts of France, where couples could rent private cubicles with heated water. You'd wash, eat, drink, and sometimes engage in, additional bonding. In fact, some bathhouses became such hotbeds of intimate activity that the church started grumbling. Bishops declared them immoral, sin-ridden, and deeply suspicious, which naturally only made people like them more. Still, not everyone could afford to splash around in a steamy tub with perfumed oils and fig wine. Peasants washed less frequently, often only wiping down with wet cloths, dunking in rivers, or using communal village tubs. But even here, there was awareness of the link between cleanliness and health, or at the very least not smelling like swamp rot. Before special occasions, particularly weddings or feast days, people made an effort to clean themselves. Medieval etiquette books actually advised young men to wash their faces, hands and genitals before attempting any kind of seduction. So yes, there was precoital hygiene protocol. And body odour? Oh, it was definitely a thing. Deodorant, as we know it, didn't exist, but people had workarounds. They used rosemary, mint and sage to scent their underarms and clothing. Lemon balm and vinegar rinses were popular. Some nobles carried pomanders, small orbs filled with herbs and spices, to discreetly sniff when someone particularly ripe walked past. And during sex, let's just say if both parties had recently dipped into a warm herbal bath, it probably wasn't too bad. If not, well, the nose eventually adapts, right? Now, what about grooming? Hair was managed, though not always in the way you might hope. Medieval men trimmed their beards or went clean-shaven depending on current fashion, while women plucked their hairlines to appear more refined. Yes, receding hairlines were considered sexy for ladies. Don't ask. As for body hair, particularly down there, we do have evidence that some folks trimmed or even shaved for both hygiene and sexual aesthetics. Medical texts mention the use of depilatory creams, usually made from quicklime and arsenic, which sounds more like a chemical weapon than a beauty product. But hey, nothing says romance like burning off your pubic hair for love. Now let's talk breath. In a time before toothbrushes and minty gum, things got interesting. People chewed herbs like parsley, fennel or cloves to freshen their mouths. Vinegar mouthwashes were common among the nobility. Teeth were cleaned with linen cloths, or twigs frayed into brushes. Still, most folks probably had a touch of dragon breath. If two lovers leaned in for a kiss, and both had recently eaten pickled onions and garlic-spiced eel, at least they were in it together. Here's a strange little fact. Some castles had entire stewing chambers, private bathing rooms attached to bedchambers, especially in wealthier households. These rooms featured tubs, perfumed water, and attendants who helped prepare couples for their nightly routine. This wasn't just about hygiene. It was part of the sexual ritual. Clean bodies, scented oils, dim lighting, maybe a lute plucking away in the background. It's all starting to sound suspiciously like a medieval spa retreat. But not everyone was thrilled about all this cleanliness. As the later Middle Ages gave way to the early Renaissance, there was a shift, especially among religious thinkers, towards seeing bathing as indulgent, even sinful. Some theologians worried that washing the body made it too pleasurable, too tempting. The church started cracking down on bathhouses, accusing them of promoting vanity and lust. Public bathing declined. Cleanliness started to be associated with moral corruption. Ironically, this may have contributed to the spread of disease during the Black Death, but we'll get to that mess later. And yet, even as bathhouses were closing, personal washing didn't vanish. People adapted. Buckets of warm water in chambers, sponging down with vinegar cloths, scented powders to cover less than fresh moments. Medieval people might not have bathed daily, but they cared. They tried. And especially before sex, whether sanctioned or sneaky, people made an effort to be at least marginally pleasant to the senses. Which brings us to one of the more debated topics among historians. Was sex actually more enjoyable when people had fewer expectations of hygiene? Or did the sensory overload, sweat, oils, the crackling fire, the scratchy sheets, create a different kind of intimacy? Some scholars argue that our modern obsession with sterility and scentlessness has sterilised passion. Others say the medieval experience was just a cloud of bacteria with moaning noises. Either way, it wasn't sterile, it was real. So picture this. A couple tucked away in a castle chamber, freshly washed in rose water, wrapped in linen towels, a plate of poached pears on the side table. There's a little harp music drifting in from the corridor. She's got her hair oiled and braided. He smells like cedar and wine. The fire crackles, and for a few short hours before the fleas wake up or the maid walks in, it almost feels like something out of a romance poem. Next time, we're throwing open the chamber doors and sneaking into other people's business. Forbidden affairs, stolen kisses, and the dangerous game of getting caught in the act, when lust met politics, and discretion was sometimes a matter of life and death. Now that we've rinsed the rosewater and shaken off the bathhouse steam, it's time to open the creaky, scandal-filled doors of medieval castle life and tiptoe straight into the deliciously dangerous territory of forbidden affairs. Because let's face it, just because people were married off for land and goats doesn't mean they stopped looking for passion elsewhere. In fact, that lack of romance in arranged marriages often created a perfect storm for temptation, opportunity, and occasionally a full-blown political disaster. Welcome to the world where lust meets espionage, and love letters could get you exiled, or executed. Let's say you're a young noblewoman, recently married to an older man who smells like dried mushrooms, and only visits your chamber twice a week, mostly to discuss crop yields. You're lonely, you're bored. Your life is a loop of embroidery, prayers, and pretending not to hear your husband snore. Then, at a feast, a certain knight, let's call him Sir Aldrich, offers to refill your wine. He's bold, handsome, and has exactly the kind of reckless jawline that makes women do impractical things. He compliments your harp playing. You both linger a little too long near the tapestries, and just like that, the seed of scandal is planted. Medieval castles were built for war, not for discretion, and yet people still managed to have affairs. Lovers passed notes under goblets, exchanged coded phrases during dances, and rendezvoused in gardens, chapels, or the one unlocked pantry no one ever seemed to check. Maids served as messengers. Confessors sometimes helped cover tracks. Even the architecture was exploited. Spiral staircases with blind corners, winding hallways, hidden stairwells, all perfect for stolen kisses and risky encounters. But make no mistake, the stakes were high. Adultery, especially among the nobility, was a crime not just against your spouse, but against your dynasty. A noblewoman's body was essentially a vault for the bloodline. Any child she birthed needed to be definitely her husband's. An affair threatened inheritance rights, property claims, and political alliances. If a woman got pregnant by someone else, the fallout could be catastrophic. So, while men were often forgiven for their indiscretions, sometimes even praised for their virility, women had to be extremely careful. And yet, it happened. Constantly. There are letters, poems, and testimonies from noble courts filled with yearning and secrecy. Take the case of Marguerite de Beaujeu, a 14th century lady whose affair with a squire was uncovered when a servant found love notes hidden inside a carved wooden duck. Her husband had the squire banished, and Marguerite locked in a convent. Harsh? Yes. But she reportedly escaped the convent 3 years later with the help of another lover. Some women just had momentum. Not all lovers were caught. In fact, some became legends. The affair between Eleanor of Aquitaine and her supposed lover, variously rumoured to be a troubadour, a knight, or her uncle's steward, was never proven, but the whispers endured for centuries. Queen Isabella of France, married to King Edward II, had a very public relationship with her military captain Roger Mortimer. Eventually the two led a rebellion, overthrew the king, and ruled in his name. Now that's taking the bedroom drama into the throne room. Men, of course, had affairs too. Lords kept mistresses openly, especially if their wives were ill, absent, or simply not deemed exciting. Some mistresses lived in nearby quarters, served under polite titles like Lady Companion, and even bore children who were then raised quietly within the household. In many cases, these illegitimate offspring received titles, land, and even positions at court. If the father was powerful enough, the rules bent around him. Still, even men had to be cautious. If the mistress was another noble's wife, or if she held political secrets, things got ugly fast. One infamous case involved a duke who was caught in bed with the wife of a rival baron. The baron didn't challenge him to a duel, instead he told the king. The king stripped the duke of his lands, and the woman was sent to a nunnery, which was medieval code for, "You embarrassed us, go disappear." Even monasteries weren't safe from scandal. Clergy who took vows of celibacy were not immune to desire. Priests, monks, and bishops often kept lovers, some openly, others secretly. One 13th century bishop was caught sneaking into a nun's quarters disguised as a travelling merchant. His punishment? Forced retirement and a lifetime supply of bitter sermons from his superiors. And let's not forget about the creative cover-ups. Some noble women passed off their lovers' children as their husbands, timing visits and manipulating birth dates. Others claimed divine intervention. One noble woman, when questioned about her sudden pregnancy while her husband was away at war, claimed she had dreamt of an angel, and then woke up pregnant. Surprisingly, it worked, likely because no one wanted to challenge divine consent in public. There's also the theory that the upper class developed coded language not just in poetry, but in fashion. Certain colours, embroidery symbols, or the placement of a brooch might signal an affair to those in the know. One scholar even argues that wearing your hair in a braid on the right side meant I am emotionally available. That might be reaching, but in a world without texting, even a strategically placed ribbon could speak volumes. Some historians argue that these secret affairs created a strange double standard, a world where women were expected to be pure yet forced into loveless marriages, where men were expected to stray yet punished if they did so too politically. Affairs became a pressure valve, a way for real emotions to leak through the carefully constructed walls of dynastic obligation. But here's where it turns heartbreaking. For every flirtatious note and moonlit tryst, there were women who suffered because they were caught in the crossfire. A lady accused of infidelity, whether guilty or not, could lose everything. Her children, her title, her life. And sometimes the accusation alone was enough. After all, proving innocence was nearly impossible. Her word against the whispers of the entire court? Good luck. Still, the human heart doesn't operate by rules and lineage charts. People longed, they touched, they risked. Behind every stiff collar and carefully arranged marriage portrait, there were real people with real desires, hiding, sneaking, burning with hope or regret. So tonight, imagine the flickering torchlight in a stone hallway. A woman clutches a note, folded into her sleeve. A man waits by a servant's entrance, heart pounding, listening for footsteps. Above them, a marriage sleeps. Around them, a castle watches. And between them, a single kiss might change everything. Next, we'll finally confront one of the most infamous myths of medieval sexuality, jus primae noctis, or the Lord's right to the first night. Did it really happen, or is it just the creepiest urban legend ever to stick? You've probably heard the tale. A newlywed couple from a medieval village ties the knot, and just when they're ready to slip off and start their new life together, bam! The local lord shows up, cape fluttering, and demands his right to spend the first night with the bride. Jus primae noctis, the so-called right of the first night. It's shown up in movies, novels, and enough bad history essays to feel like it must have been real. But tonight, we're cracking this myth wide open. Because while it makes for a juicy story, the truth is far more complicated, and in some ways even darker. Let's start with the basics. Jus primae noctis is Latin for right of the first night, and it refers to the alleged legal or customary right of a feudal lord to sleep with a vassal's bride on her wedding night. It's been painted as the ultimate abuse of power, a cruel reminder that no one, not even newlyweds, could escape the grip of the ruling class. But here's the plot twist. There's very little credible evidence that it was ever a widespread, legally enforced practice. In fact, most modern historians agree. It probably didn't happen the way pop culture says it did. Which is not to say everything was sunshine and respect in feudal sex politics. Far from it. First, let's understand why the myth stuck. The idea of jus primae noctis began to appear in literature and folklore during the late Middle Ages, and especially in early modern plays and stories. Think Shakespeare era, when poking fun at corrupt nobles was fashionable, and people loved tales of overreaching lords getting what they deserved. These stories weren't reporting facts. They were exaggerations, symbols of injustice, metaphors for class exploitation. Over time, though, fiction started to blur with historical memory, and what began as satire hardened into fact. But here's the frustrating part. There were abuses of power that looked very similar. Lords, especially in rural or isolated areas, absolutely exploited their authority to pressure, seduce, or outright assault women of lower status. They didn't need a written law to do it. Power imbalance was its own kind of permission. A local lord might not declare a legal right to a bride's virginity, but if he asked, Strongly, it was hard to say no. Consent in these scenarios was a murky compromise thing, so while Jus Primae Noctes probably wasn't a formal institution, that doesn't mean it was just a fantasy. Let's say you're a young peasant woman in the 13th century France. Your family leases land from the local baron. Your father owes him taxes, labour and fealty. Now you're getting married. The baron hears about it. Maybe he sends a gift, a fine cloth, a wine jug, and suggests you come serve in the castle for a few weeks. Maybe he comes to the wedding. Maybe he dances with you, drinks too much, and then offers to bless your marriage. You know what he means. Your parents look away. Your new husband says nothing. It's not a law, but it feels like one. In this sense, the myth of Jus Primae Noctis survives because it captures a real rotten truth about power and sexuality. It packages something messy, coercion, fear, class domination, into a clear, if inaccurate, label. It simplifies the shame. For generations, people believed in it not just because they were misinformed, but because it explained the uncomfortable silences in their own histories. There are documents from medieval and early modern Europe that mention lords receiving some kind of wedding tax or symbolic first rites from their peasants. But the details matter. In most cases, these were ceremonial fees or duties like paying a fine to marry off a daughter or offering a symbolic gift to the lord. Sometimes that gift was called a merchet. The name sounds ominous, but it was usually just money, not a person. Scholars believe these customs were twisted over time, misinterpreted by outsiders, and exaggerated in storytelling. One unusual reference comes from medieval Scotland, where something called le droit du seigneur, the French equivalent, appeared in land records. But again, there's no clear proof that it ever involved sex. Some historians argue it was always about money, not bodies, another clever way for lords to squeeze the peasantry. Leave it to bureaucracy to turn oppression into paperwork. There's also the problem of translation. Many of the terms used in feudal records are vague or symbolic. First rites, marriage dues, bedding rites, all of these could mean money, ceremonial gestures, or actual physical intrusion, depending on the context. Over centuries, as these records were copied, mistranslated, or sensationalized, the meaning shifted. By the time Renaissance writers got hold of it, Jus Primae Noctis had become a scandalous storytelling device, ready-made for plays, operas, and moral outrage. Take Voltaire, for example. In his satirical writings, he railed against Jus Primae Noctis as evidence of medieval barbarism. He didn't cite actual legal cases, he just assumed it had happened because it fit his narrative of progress. Later, Enlightenment thinkers repeated the myth to show how far society had come. Ironically, by using the past as a moral punching bag, they helped cement the very myth they thought they were condemning. Even today, the idea persists. Movies, TV shows, and novels love the drama of a cruel lord taking what isn't his. It's visceral. It gives the audience someone to hate, but it also oversimplifies. Real medieval women didn't face one clear legal threat on their wedding night. They lived in a world of ongoing complex vulnerability, and that's much harder to fit into a neat movie scene. Now, here's a strange twist. In a few cultures, far outside medieval Europe, there were documented practices where tribal leaders or elders had sexual access to women as part of ritual or symbolic customs. Some anthropologists have pointed to this as proof that Jus Primae Noctis had ancient roots. But these comparisons are slippery, culturally insensitive, and don't justify assuming European lords had similar rights. Power, sex, and ritual intersect in many societies, but they don't always mean the same thing. So, back to the castle. Imagine you're a bride in a small village, tying your girdle nervously before the feast. You've heard stories of lords who took liberties, of maids who disappeared, of children born with suspiciously noble features. The fear is real, the rules are unclear, and even if there's no law carved in stone, the threat lingers like smoke in the rafters. That's the legacy of Jus Primae Noctis, not as a proven legal institution, but as a symbol of the very real abuse and fear women faced in a rigidly hierarchical world. It reminds us that what people believe can be just as powerful as what's written in law. Next time, we're peeking behind monastery walls and peering into convent windows, because even among the pious and cloistered, desire didn't disappear. It just got a new uniform, and a whole lot of guilt. Tonight, we tiptoe past the clanging swords and noble scandals and slip quietly through the arched stone doors of monasteries and convents. those serene candlelit sanctuaries where monks and nuns vowed to live lives of chastity, silence, and spiritual purity. Sounds like a sex-free zone, right? Not quite. Because beneath the rosary beads and hymns, under the scratchy wool habits and hard wooden pews, a very human truth persisted. People don't stop wanting just because they've taken a vow. Welcome to the world of celibacy loopholes, monastic longing, and religious guilt with a side of midnight rendezvous. Let's start with the rules. The Church was very clear, at least in theory. From the early Middle Ages onward, monks and nuns were expected to embrace celibacy, meaning no marriage, no sex, not even a hint of carnal desire, and not just physical abstinence. This went for thoughts, dreams, unholy stirrings of the flesh, and anything resembling pleasure. The Rule of St. Benedict, one of the founding texts of Western monasticism, instructed monks to guard their hearts and bodies at all times, avoiding even touch. To the devout, the body was a vessel to be subdued, trained like a stubborn mule, and denied the temptations of the world. But of course, people are people, and monasteries and convents, despite their rigid rules and isolation, were not immune to the pull of attraction. Let's be honest. Take a group of people, remove outside distractions, stick them behind stone walls and forbid them from touching each other, and you've basically created the most intense, slow-burn romance environment imaginable. Monks and nuns shared living spaces, worked together, prayed together. They formed bonds. Emotional intimacy flourished in quiet corners, in the scriptoria where they copied manuscripts, in the kitchens where they baked bread, and in the gardens where they tended herbs side by side in the moonlight. Even the confessional could become a place of connection, as sins were whispered across the divide with trembling voices. The Church worried about this, of course. That's why many orders imposed strict separation between male and female houses, sometimes even building walled walkways for nuns to move between buildings without being seen. Still, desire found cracks in the mortar. There are recorded cases, many of them hushed up or buried under layers of euphemism, of monks and nuns breaking their vows. Sometimes it was a single tryst, sometimes a long-term, deeply emotional affair. In one particularly dramatic 14th century case, a monk and a nun were caught exchanging love poems hidden inside hollowed-out prayer books. Another couple met in the infirmary during night duty and managed to keep their relationship secret for over a year before a jealous novice exposed them. Their punishment? Public confession, fasting, isolation, and reassignment to monasteries 200 miles apart. A medieval breakup via forced relocation. And what happened when someone got pregnant? Oh, it happened. Nuns who became pregnant either disappeared into silence, were quietly moved to other convents, or, in the worst cases, were excommunicated and turned out onto the streets. One infamous scandal involved a convent in Spain, where 4 nuns gave birth over the course of 2 years. The bishop claimed the devil had infiltrated the walls. Locals suspected a visiting priest. The nuns? They never confessed, not even under pressure. Scholars today think they were protecting each other. One scholar referred to this as spiritual sisterhood turned survival pact. Some monasteries tried to get ahead of temptation by enforcing extreme discipline. Nighttime inspections, bars on windows, no talking unless absolutely necessary. But others took a softer approach, encouraging spiritual intimacy while quietly ignoring what happened behind closed doors. The truth is, many religious leaders understood that sexuality didn't vanish with a vow. It just had to be managed, redirected, or buried so deep under guilt that it couldn't crawl out during evening prayers. Here's a quirky little detail. Medieval medical theory believed that sexual release was a necessary part of male health. According to some interpretations of Galenic medicine, men who didn't ejaculate regularly could become sick, even mad. So how did this square with monks? In some cases it didn't. There are references, often cloaked in academic Latin, of monks suffering nocturnal emissions and seeking medical treatment for the shame. Some doctors prescribed cold baths, fasting, and vigorous manual labour as remedies. Others just muttered about the dangers of idle hands and prayed harder. But desire in religious life wasn't always heterosexual. There's solid evidence that same-sex attraction existed and sometimes blossomed within monastic communities. In male-only or female-only spaces, close emotional bonds could become romantic, even physical. There are love letters between monks that read like sonnets. Sisterhoods, where certain spiritual friendships were visibly more than platonic. The church officially condemned homosexual behaviour, labelling it unnatural and sinful, but behind the cloistered walls these relationships continued, quietly, cautiously, and sometimes with the support of fellow members who knew better than to judge. Some historians argue that monastic life actually encouraged emotional intimacy, even if it didn't intend to. Living apart from the outside world, monks and nuns formed deep attachments. Their love was often coded as spiritual, a merging of souls through Christ, but it walked a thin line. One 12th century abbot wrote of a fellow monk, "His presence quickened my prayers. His absence made the psalms feel hollow. Is that friendship or longing with a halo?" And of course, we can't talk about desire behind monastery walls without mentioning Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, mystic, composer, and all-around medieval powerhouse. While she herself was deeply devout and emphasised spiritual purity, her writings include vivid, sometimes erotically charged visions of divine love. Some scholars interpret her descriptions of union with God as metaphors for deeply repressed physical yearning. Others see them as genuinely mystical. Maybe both. Hildegard was complicated like that. Then there's Abelard and Eloise, the philosopher monk and the brilliant young woman he tutored. Their tragic love story, which began outside the monastery but ended with both taking vows, is one of the most famous medieval romances. Their letters, preserved through centuries, reveal a heartbreaking tension between spiritual duty and lingering physical desire. Even years after becoming a nun, Eloise wrote, "At night, when I lie in my cell, it is not prayers that come to my lips, but memories of our past pleasures." Not exactly your average monastery motto. So what does all this mean? Were monasteries hotbeds of secret romance? Not exactly. Most monks and nuns took their vows seriously. Many lived chaste, disciplined lives, devoting themselves fully to prayer, scholarship, and service. But among them were the quiet exceptions, the stolen glances, the hidden letters, the muffled sobs in the chapel after a night of breaking a vow they'd meant to keep. Desire didn't disappear in the cloister. It dressed in robes, lit candles, and whispered through stone corridors. And for those who felt it, whether briefly or deeply, it came with an avalanche of guilt, introspection, and sometimes heartbreak. The struggle wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, a daily battle between body and soul, fought in silence with no one watching, except maybe God. Next, we're stepping into the public square to see what happened when things went wrong. Sex outside the rules didn't always stay secret, and when it became a scandal, punishment followed. Stocks, whippings, public shame, and the occasional vegetable thrown for dramatic effect. So you've wandered through monasteries and watched desire weave through stone cloisters and confessionals. But what happens when a rendezvous, or even just a rumour, breaks out into the open? What happens when sex, that most private of things, crashes through the stained glass and right into the dusty, judgmental heart of the medieval public square? Welcome to the world of sexual punishment and public shame. No locked bedroom door or whispered apology here. This is where people paid for their passion with bruises, fines, and the ever-popular humiliation of being pelted with whatever rotten produce was within arm's reach. In medieval Europe, sexual misbehaviour wasn't just a private matter, it was a public offence, and the punishments were just as public. Think stocks, pillories, forced parades, shaved heads, and enough moral outrage to power a cathedral bell. The laws varied by region and severity, but the message was always clear: sex was sacred within marriage and scandalous outside it. And if you stepped out of the line, the village was going to watch. Let's start with the basics. Adultery? Bad. Fornication? Also bad. Homosexual acts? Sinful and often criminalised. Promiscuity? Shameful, especially for women. And while the church was busy defining the ever-expanding list of sins of the flesh, local governments were the ones tasked with dishing out consequences. In many towns, councils or lords handled these offences through a mix of civic punishment and religious penance. It was like getting grounded by your parents and sent to confession. Now picture this. You're a baker's wife in a small town, caught in a compromising situation with the cooper's apprentice. Someone sees, someone talks. By sunrise, you're both dragged before the town magistrate. If you're lucky, it ends with a fine and some harsh words. If not, you're sentenced to a day in the pillory, standing on a platform with your head and hands locked in wooden boards, while the villagers throw cabbage heads and stale bread at you. and that's if they're feeling merciful. The pillory wasn't just about restraint, it was about display. You weren't hidden in a dungeon, you were planted in the middle of your community, forced to endure hours of mocking, shaming, and possibly worse. Children heckled, neighbours whispered, your reputation eviscerated. And let's be real, once you'd been up there, no one ever looked at you the same again. There was no medieval PR firm to manage the fallout. But the punishments weren't just for the participants. In some towns, anyone facilitating a sexual offence, maids, innkeepers, even priests, could be punished for aiding or abetting sin. An innkeeper who let a couple share a room without proof of marriage might be fined or have their establishment temporarily shut down. A maid who helped sneak in a lover could be whipped or dismissed. The message was clear: don't just mind your own business, police everyone else's too. There were especially harsh penalties for women. In many cases, men and women who committed the same offence received very different punishments. A man caught in adultery might pay a fine or be temporarily barred from church sacraments. A woman could be flogged, paraded through the streets, or branded with a hot iron. One infamous case from 15th century England involved a nobleman's wife accused, without solid proof, of sleeping with a servant. She was stripped of her titles, locked in a tower, and forbidden to see her children. The servant, he vanished. Either he fled, was paid off, or got a stern lecture and a new job. Prostitution carried its own complicated set of rules. In some towns it was tolerated, regulated even. Prostitutes were required to wear specific clothing, live in designated areas, and pay taxes. But if they stepped out of line or worked without permission, punishment came fast. Shaving the head was common, a visible, humiliating mark. Others were forced to walk through town holding signs that read, "I have sinned," or worse, led by ropes through the marketplace like livestock. In some regions, convicted prostitutes were permanently banned from marrying respectable men. Their past was branded onto their future. And then there were the more creative punishments. In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, couples accused of adultery might be forced to ride backwards on a donkey through the village, wearing mismatched clothes, while townsfolk laughed and shouted. In Italy, a woman accused of seducing a priest might have her hair shorn and be displayed on church steps during Sunday Mass. In France, some towns held public shaming feasts, where accused parties had to serve food to the very neighbours who had reported them. Talk about awkward dinner parties. But here's a strange wrinkle. Sometimes public punishment increased a person's notoriety in weird, semi-fame-like ways. There are stories of women who, after being punished, leaned into the scandal and reinvented themselves as dangerous seductresses. Some became professional mistresses or courtesans, using their infamy as currency. They played into the reputation and found a kind of twisted empowerment in it. One woman in Avignon, after 3 public floggings, reportedly opened her own bathhouse, catering to a very particular clientele. And let's not forget the role of the church. Penance was part of the process. After your civic punishment, you'd often be required to confess publicly, fast for weeks, wear sackcloth to mass, or stand outside the church barefoot in winter. Priests held the power to absolve, or not, and many took their sweet time. Sometimes people performed these penances voluntarily, hoping to avoid harsher punishments, a kind of spiritual plea bargain. Scholars debate how effective all this public shaming really was. Did it actually prevent people from engaging in sexual sin? Or did it just teach them to be sneakier about it? Some argue that the real goal wasn't correction but control, a visible warning that social order was being upheld, even if everyone knew affairs and trysts still happened behind closed doors. Others say it offered a kind of emotional release for communities. In a world with few entertainments, public humiliation filled the role of reality TV. You watched someone get dragged through the mud and felt just a little cleaner by comparison. Still, the emotional toll was real. Families were torn apart. Children carried their parents' disgrace for years. Women especially bore the brunt of the long-term consequences. While a man might eventually redeem himself through marriage or military service, a woman labelled unchaste could lose her marriage prospects, her home, and even her ability to survive. The stigma clung to her like wet wool. So tonight, imagine a small town square, the crowd gathered buzzing with curiosity. A platform's been built. 2 lovers stand beside it, heads bowed. A clerk reads the charges. A priest clutches a Bible. Someone throws a turnip. It's messy. it's cruel. And yet for the people watching, it's theatre, a morality play starring their own neighbours. The message is clear. Sex outside the rules is not just risky, it's spectacle. Next, we slip into the hidden lives of those who didn't fit the binary. LGBTQ+ existence in medieval castles wasn't loud, but it was there, hidden in glances, cloaked in language, and surviving in silence. Tonight we turn down the noise of public punishments and step into a softer, quieter realm. The realm of people who didn't fit into the tidy categories medieval society tried so hard to enforce. We're talking about queer lives in the Middle Ages, LGBTQ+ identities, relationships, and expressions that existed behind stone walls and beneath layers of secrecy, metaphor, and coded language. These weren't identities people claimed in the way we do now. There was no medieval pride parade behind the castle gates, but queerness existed, stubbornly, beautifully, often dangerously, and always more complex than the official narrative allowed. Let's start by stating the obvious. Medieval society didn't exactly hand out safe space stickers. The church, which dominated every level of life, taught that non-heterosexual acts were sins. Sodomy, a catch-all term, covered everything from same-sex activity to masturbation to anything that didn't directly aim for procreation. If it wasn't penis in vagina with a chance of baby making, it was suspect. And yet, for all that moral rigidity, people still found ways to love differently, desire differently, and in some cases, live differently. Among men, same-sex relationships were more visible, partly because they were more aggressively policed. Clerical writings warned about men forming particular friendships, especially in monasteries, schools, or knightly circles. But if you scratch past the church's anxiety, you'll find letters, poems, and court records that tell a different story. Some of these male bonds were deeply affectionate, emotionally intense, and in certain cases physically intimate. Take the Brotherhood of Knights. The chivalric bond often included vows of loyalty, shared sleeping quarters, and intimate correspondence. While not all of these relationships were romantic or sexual, the language used in many knightly letters is striking. "I long for the touch of your hand," one 14th century knight wrote to his companion. "Your absence is a wound that bleeds without end." That's not just, "Thanks for the sword lesson, bro," that's yearning. In elite circles, some men maintained long-term relationships with other men, while marrying women for political reasons. This wasn't widely accepted, but in some cases, it was tolerated as long as the lovers were discreet and fulfilled their dynastic duties. Historians point to figures like King Edward II of England, whose close relationship with Piers Gaveston raised eyebrows even in his own time. The king lavished titles and gifts on Gaveston, wrote him letters laced with tenderness, and had nobles openly accusing them of an improper relationship. Eventually the nobility rebelled, whether from political jealousy or genuine moral panic, and Gaveston was executed. Edward's grief was very public. His enemies? They made it part of the reason he was later deposed. Among women, things were more complicated, because female sexuality itself was often ignored, erased, or dismissed. Two women could live together, raise children, even share a bed, and society might interpret it as friendship. In fact, female sworn friendships, or spiritual sisterhoods, were common in religious settings and sometimes among noble women. But occasionally the connection between two women was too passionate, too physical, or too emotionally charged to hide. One of the most famous cases comes from 15th century France, where a woman named Laurence was tried for unnatural practices with her companion Johanna. Witnesses claimed they shared a bed, used wooden phalluses, and referred to each other as wife and husband. The court convicted Laurence, who was sentenced to death by burning. Johanna recanted and was spared. The records are sparse, but the pain behind the language is unmistakable. Their love, whether physical or emotional or both, was real enough to terrify the authorities. Sometimes, queerness slipped past censors in the form of literature. Troubadour poetry occasionally contained veiled references to same-sex affection. In religious texts, mystics described their union with God in ways that sound more erotic than ethereal. Julian of Norwich wrote of Christ as a mother, and described the soul's love for him with an intensity that hints at deeper yearnings. Female saints sometimes wrote to one another with language so charged it makes modern scholars blush. Whether these were purely spiritual expressions or cloaked desires, we may never know, but they show that queerness wasn't absent. It was just speaking in a different dialect. And then there's gender. Medieval people didn't think about gender the way we do now. Binary categories of man and woman were seen as divine and fixed. But even then, some people lived in ways that defied those categories. There are records of individuals assigned female at birth who dressed and lived as men, sometimes entering monasteries, serving as soldiers or marrying women. One such person was Hildegund of Schönau, who lived as a monk named Joseph for years before being discovered after death. The reaction? Confused, reverent, slightly panicked. Rather than erase the story, the church canonized it as a miracle. God, they decided, had hidden her identity for his own mysterious purposes. Because admitting someone might have chosen that life? Too scandalous. Cross-dressing was also used in times of necessity. Joan of Arc famously wore men's clothing, not just as battle gear, but even in prison, to protect herself from sexual assault. For this crime, among others, she was burned. Her executioners called her heretical. Centuries later, the church canonized her as a saint. The irony drips thicker than candle wax. We even have court records showing individuals defending their right to live as a gender, different from what was expected. In one German case from the 14th century, a person named Thomasine asked to be recognised as male and allowed to inherit land. The court eventually agreed, though not without a lot of muttering about God's design. The verdict was seen as practical, not philosophical, but still it cracks the door open. Even in a rigidly gendered world, people found ways. Scholars still argue over how we should interpret these stories. Were these individuals truly expressing queer identities, or just reacting to social constraints? It's hard to say. The language of the time didn't include words like transgender or non-binary, and people didn't organise around shared identities the way modern LGBTQ+ communities do. But the feelings, the lives, the experiences, those are real. They always have been. There's something haunting about reading these fragments. The love letters tucked into margins, the court testimonies heavy with fear, the songs that hint at longing no one dared name aloud. They speak to resilience, to courage, to the enduring human need to connect, even in a world built to deny that connection. So tonight, picture a quiet corner of a castle courtyard. Two squires sparring with wooden swords, laughing a little too long. A noblewoman writing a poem for her dearest friend, her handwriting trembling. A monk, eyes closed in prayer, unsure whether the ache in his chest is for God or the brother kneeling beside him. Next, we leave the emotional world behind and face the inevitable consequence of so much sexual activity. Childbirth. Get ready for midwives, miracle potions and delivery rooms filled with superstition, screaming, and more than a little blood. Now we've explored love in hidden letters and longing behind cloistered walls. It's time to deal with what often followed all that medieval intimacy, wanted or not. Childbirth. You might be imagining a gentle candlelit scene with soft music and supportive. Husbands, go ahead and erase that. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was intense, risky, loud, and absolutely soaked in superstition, blood, and herbal poultices that smelled like feet. It wasn't just a medical event, it was a test of survival, a religious ordeal, and in many cases a woman's defining moment whether she wanted it to be or not. Let's start with the basics. If you were a woman of childbearing age in the medieval world, pregnancy was both expected and deeply terrifying. There was no understanding of germs, no pain relief worth mentioning, no prenatal vitamins, and no ultrasounds to check if your baby had 10 fingers or, another head. You got pregnant, you hoped for the best, and you prayed. A lot. Because giving birth was a roll of the dice, and more than a few women didn't survive the game. Midwives were the unsung heroes of the medieval birthing world. They were women with practical knowledge, passed down from generation to generation, often learned through observation and repetition rather than formal training. These midwives knew which herbs to use to stimulate labour, how to reposition a breech baby with their bare hands, and how to tell if a labouring woman was going to make it through the night. They were tough, resourceful, and usually over 40, which in medieval terms meant they were practically immortal. But midwifery also came with risk. If a birth went wrong, guess who got blamed? Not the mother, and certainly not the absent husband. It was the midwife. she could be accused of incompetence, witchcraft, or moral failing. And because these women wielded knowledge of the female body that male physicians didn't understand or even want to learn, they were viewed with suspicion. A midwife who was too skilled might be praised one year and burned at the stake the next. Gotta love that job security. Now imagine the scene. You're a pregnant woman, 9 months along, already exhausted from hauling water and kneading bread with your swollen feet. Labour starts in the middle of the night, because of course it does. You're ushered into the birthing chamber, a space cleared out and warmed by the fire, sometimes draped with holy relics or herbs to encourage an easy delivery. Men are banished. Only the midwife and a few female relatives or neighbours are allowed inside. They boil water, they whisper prayers, they light candles to saints, especially Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth, who was famously swallowed by a dragon and burst out of its stomach unharmed. Very much the vibe women were going for during delivery. There was no such thing as a delivery table. Most women gave birth squatting, kneeling, or perched on a birthing stool. A wooden chair with a hole cut in the centre so the baby could fall through like some terrifying vending machine prize. The midwife knelt below, hands ready, calling out instructions and sometimes cursing, because this wasn't a peaceful process. It was gritty, physical, and completely consuming. A woman might scream, faint, or chant psalms between contractions. Others cursed their husbands or swore never to do this again, which, of course, they usually did. Because contraception was, shall we say, limited. There were rituals too. Holy water was sprinkled. Charms were tied around the labouring woman's wrists. Some women wore amulets filled with dried umbilical cords from previous births. Yes, that was a thing. Others kept small bones from animals or herbs like rue and vervain under their pillows, believed to ward off evil spirits that might steal the baby's soul. If labour stalled, the midwife might open every door and window in the house to unblock the path. Or, in truly desperate moments, she might instruct the woman's husband to dig a symbolic grave outside, to trick death into thinking its job was done. And the pain? Oh, the pain was real. But unlike today's birth culture, where pain management is a science, medieval women were told their suffering was divine punishment. It was Eve's fault, after all. Original sin, apple, snake. You know the story. Women were supposed to suffer in childbirth. It was proof of their moral purification. Some religious leaders even preached that women who used herbs to dull the pain were interfering with God's will. Because nothing says compassion like, you must suffer so God knows you're sorry. If the birth went well, there was celebration. The baby was swaddled tightly and taken for immediate baptism, preferably within days, sometimes hours. Unbaptized babies who died were believed to linger in limbo, unable to reach heaven. This created a panicked rush for even sick or premature infants to be christened quickly. In emergencies, midwives were permitted to perform the rite themselves using holy water and a quick prayer, their hands shaking as they whispered Latin while holding a barely breathing newborn. If the mother survived, she wasn't out of the woods yet. Postpartum infections were common, as were fevers, hemorrhage and childbed fever, what we now know as sepsis, usually caused by unwashed hands or tools. Recovery was slow, painful, and mostly expected to happen while the woman resumed chores. If she didn't die, she was considered lucky. If she gave birth to a son, she was praised. A daughter? Slightly less so. 2 daughters in a row. People started whispering about curses or weak wombs, because of course. And what about the babies? Mortality rates were sky high. As many as 1 in 3 infants didn't survive the first year. Many didn't survive the first week. A birth was a hopeful moment, but always one tinged with fear. Parents often waited to name their babies until after baptism, or even until they were several days old. Too many had seen infants die before the cradle was even warmed. Despite all this, some women found strength in the birthing process. It was one of the few domains in medieval life entirely controlled by women. Midwives had authority. Mothers earned respect. The pain, though brutal, created a kind of bond. One forged not just in shared suffering, but in shared survival. Even the language of birth was sacred. To be delivered wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. A woman was brought through the valley of death and back, and that for many was a kind of miracle. Of course men mostly stayed out of it. Fathers weren't expected to be in the room. Their job was to pace outside, drink too much, pray, or disappear to the nearest tavern and wait for word. If the baby was a boy, there'd be celebration. If not, well, they'd try again, and again, and again. So tonight, picture a smoky birthing room lit by firelight and flickering candles. A woman grips the arms of a wooden stool, sweat pouring down her face. The midwife kneels below, murmuring instructions. A psalm plays softly in the background. Outside, a nervous husband waits with a flask. Upstairs, the baby's first cry will pierce the silence, and with it, a wave of hope, terror, and relief. Next, we're not done with reproductive chaos just yet. Now, it's time for birth control, such as it was. Potions, prayers, herbs, and the ever-popular just don't do it on a full moon. Now that we've laboured through medieval childbirth, messy, holy, terrifying, it's only fair to ask, did anyone try to prevent all that drama? You know, take a little precaution before playing the medieval version of We'll Be Careful? The answer is yes, absolutely. Birth control, or at least the idea of it, existed in medieval times. People just didn't call it that. They called it preserving honour, avoiding shame, spacing children, or in some cases simply witchcraft. Tonight we're taking a deep breath and diving into the murky, often herbal-smelling world of medieval contraception. Let's get this out of the way first. The Church did not approve. In fact, using contraception of any kind was considered a sin. Why? Because every act of sex was supposed to be open to reproduction. That was the holy ideal, the divine design, the inflexible rule carved into sermons, confessional manuals and sweaty priestly lectures from the pulpit. The Church taught that trying to block conception was a rebellion against God's will, an attempt to separate pleasure from purpose, and we certainly couldn't have that. But despite the looming threat of damnation, medieval people still found ways to prevent pregnancy. The truth is, they weren't clueless. They knew how babies were made, and they knew, vaguely, how not to make them. Most of their methods fell into 4 overlapping categories: withdrawal, timing, herbal remedies, and sheer magical thinking. Let's start with the oldest and perhaps most widespread method: withdrawal, or as your high school health teacher may have called it, pulling out. Yes, medieval men were absolutely practicing this. It was probably the most commonly used technique, and while not the most effective, it didn't require any tools, ingredients, or ritual chanting. Of course, it relied heavily on timing and trust, which, as you can imagine, was a gamble in an age where calendars were iffy and men weren't exactly trained in self-control. The next method was fertility tracking, based on observations of a woman's cycle. This one's tricky, because while some women definitely noticed patterns, cramps, bleeding, signs of ovulation, they didn't have microscopes or hormone strips to back them up. Still, certain texts, especially those written by female healers, make reference to avoiding sex during the fertile phase, even if their math was questionable. One guide suggested waiting until 7 days after the flowers, then counting 3 moons. Interpret that as you will. But the real treasure trove of medieval birth control came from the herbal world. Midwives and so-called wise women knew dozens of plants they claimed could prevent conception. One of the most famous was silphium, a plant so effective, and possibly tasty, that it was harvested into extinction by the 1st century. But its legend lived on in medieval herbals. Women might also drink infusions of pennyroyal, Queen Anne's lace, rue, or tansy, herbs believed to either prevent pregnancy or flush out early ones. These concoctions were sometimes brewed as teas, sometimes soaked in wine, sometimes applied directly in ways you probably don't want detailed before bedtime. Now, were they effective? Some of them, yes, at least mildly. Pennyroyal and tansy, for example, have properties that can affect the uterus, though in high doses they're toxic, so women were essentially gambling with their lives to avoid another child. Not exactly an ideal system, but when faced with the risk of dangerous childbirth or starvation from having too many mouths to feed, it's not hard to see why some took the risk. Then there were barrier methods, rudimentary, yes, but mentioned in a few surviving texts. One Arab medical manuscript describes inserting a sponge soaked in vinegar into the vagina before intercourse. Some sources mention using wax or animal bladders as a sort of condom, though these references are rare and often surrounded by judgmental commentary. Still, the fact that anyone even thought of these methods shows that people were trying to get creative with their reproductive future. And now we get to the truly oddball territory: magic. because when herbs and timing failed, people turned to spells, charms, and straight-up superstitions. One popular belief held that tying a specific knot in a cord and wearing it around the thigh would close the womb. Others involved whispering prayers to St. Anne while burying a chicken bone in the doorway. One German folktale suggests placing a frog in your bed, whispering your lover's name into its ear, and then letting it hop away. This was supposed to ensure you wouldn't conceive. Did it work? Probably not. But hey, at least you got a bedtime story out of it. Some midwives were known to create conception amulets, small pouches filled with herbs, feathers, bits of iron, and sometimes scriptural quotes, all sewn into fabric and worn against the skin. The line between medicine and magic was blurry at best, especially when it came to sex and fertility. If a woman had success with a potion or charm, she passed it on. If it failed, well, that was chalked up to fate or God's mysterious plan. Of course, all of this had to be done very quietly. The use of contraception was not only frowned upon by the church, it could be considered heretical. Women who brewed potions for women's troubles were sometimes accused of being witches, especially if they were successful. One successful midwife in Florence was arrested after too many noble women claimed her herbs cured unwanted swelling. You know, that swelling. She denied everything but was still whipped in the marketplace and had her shop seized. Still, for many women, especially those with multiple children and limited resources, these folk methods were survival tools. Families couldn't always afford more mouths to feed, and a woman who bore too many children too close together was at greater risk of dying in childbirth. So even if the church was wagging its finger and warning of eternal damnation, the midwife was probably whispering more useful advice about pennyroyal tea and counting moons. Interestingly, some theologians even debated whether abstinence inside marriage was sinful, if used to avoid pregnancy. Augustine, always the buzzkill, said that even a married couple choosing not to procreate for selfish reasons was sinful. But other thinkers, especially later in the Middle Ages, offered more nuanced takes, acknowledging that not every couple could handle a dozen kids and a goat. Still, this was a conversation dominated by men who had never experienced childbirth. Unsurprisingly, practical knowledge about birth control stayed in the hands and kitchens of women. So tonight, picture a woman stirring a clay pot over a fire, glancing out the window as her children play. She adds a sprig of rue, mutters a prayer, and pours the liquid into a small cup. It tastes bitter. She drinks it anyway, not because she wants to sin, not because she's wicked, but because she knows what another pregnancy might mean, and she's not ready. Not yet. Next time, we explore the darkest chapter in our journey, what happened when sex wasn't consensual. From noble courts to peasant fields, sexual violence was a reality, often silenced, sometimes punished, and always soaked in injustice. We've walked through shadowed bedrooms and whispered love letters. We've seen the hopeful cup of pennyroyal tea, and now we come to the place medieval history often tries to look away from, the part that's not poetic, not romantic, not even mischief, wrapped in innuendo. Tonight we face one of the harshest, most heartbreaking aspects of sexual life in medieval times. Sexual violence, assault, coercion, exploitation. It existed in every layer of society, from castle halls to peasant huts, and while the Middle Ages produced 1,000 songs about noble love, it had no song for this, just silence. And when the silence broke, it was usually followed by shame, not justice. Let's start with a grim reality. Rape, though often whispered about in vague or euphemistic terms, was recognised as a crime in medieval Europe. But recognition didn't mean protection. The laws, when they existed, were written by men, enforced by men, and interpreted almost entirely in favour of male interests. Women who were raped had to prove it had happened, often by showing physical injury or by demonstrating their own resistance. And if a woman didn't scream loud enough, fight hard enough, or report it fast enough, well, then clearly she must have wanted it. Sound familiar? One particularly cruel legal assumption held that pregnancy from rape meant consent. Medieval scholars, leaning on bad medical theories, claimed that a woman could not conceive unless she experienced pleasure. So, if she became pregnant, it must not have been rape. This absurd logic wasn't fringe. It showed up in legal codes, sermons, and even courtroom arguments. The idea was simple. A virtuous woman would never enjoy the act. And if she did, even under duress, she was complicit. The The social consequences were equally brutal. For many women, especially those of noble families, being raped wasn't just a physical violation, it was a social death sentence. Virginity was still currency, and if a woman lost it through violence, she was often treated as damaged goods. Some were sent to convents, others were forced into marriages with the very men who assaulted them. Yes, that's right. Marrying your rapist was in some cases the legal remedy. It restored her honour, according to the law, as if honour were a smudge to be wiped away with a wedding ring. Let's look at an example. In the 14th century France, a nobleman named Jean de Carouge accused another knight, Jacques Le Gris, of raping his wife, Marguerite. The case became legendary, not because Marguerite found justice, but because it led to one of the last legally sanctioned trial-by-combat duels in Europe. Jean and Jacques fought to the death while Marguerite waited, knowing that if her husband lost, the court would declare her accusation false, and she would be burned alive for perjury. Let that sink in. A woman's truth was placed quite literally on the edge of a sword. Jean won, but the entire affair was less about Marguerite's trauma and more about male pride, reputation, and feudal vengeance. Her suffering became the backdrop to a very public, very masculine drama. Among peasants, the system was even crueler. A poor woman who accused a man, especially one of higher, social standing, had little chance of being believed. Landowners, knights, and travelling clergy often used their status to pressure or force themselves on women with few means of resistance. Some victims were dismissed outright, others were threatened, paid off, or simply ignored. If they became pregnant, they bore the child alone, their reputation shattered. And if the child died, or if someone accused the mother of infanticide, the woman could be tried and executed. One mistake, one misstep, and everything could fall apart. And yet, the laws themselves weren't silent. In some places, rape was punishable by heavy fines, mutilation, or even death. English law in the 13th century prescribed hanging for men convicted of rape. But conviction was rare, and punishment rarer still, especially if the rapist was a nobleman, soldier, or priest. Powerful men had layers of protection. Their victims had none. Speaking of priests, the Church's relationship with sexual violence was complex and often hypocritical. Priests preached chastity and virtue, but frequently broke their vows. There are records of priests assaulting women during confession, offering forgiveness in exchange for favours, or using their position to exploit vulnerable widows or girls. When caught, many were quietly reassigned to other parishes, a practice that should sound uncomfortably familiar. Only in the most egregious cases was a cleric defrocked or excommunicated, and the victims, usually forgotten. Even in warfare, rape was used as a weapon. During sieges or raids, women were routinely targeted. Soldiers believed it was their right, the spoils of war, a sign of conquest. Chronicles describe it casually, sometimes even with admiration, as if brutality were a form of valour. One monk wrote of a siege where the women were taken as is customary, as if rape were no more unusual than looting grain. Some commanders tried to enforce discipline, but many didn't. Others, like mercenary bands roaming the countryside, had no rules at all. Their violence left entire villages shattered, and women broken not just physically but socially, often blamed for what was done to them. And yet, in the margins, we find voices of resistance. Women who told their stories, wives who testified in court even under threat, mothers who hid their daughters, midwives who refused to name rape victims in church confessions. Their names are mostly lost, but their actions ripple through the records, brief flashes of courage in a system built to silence them. There's one recorded case of a woman in 15th century Germany who stabbed her attacker and was later acquitted, an incredibly rare outcome. The judge ruled that she had acted in defence of her bodily dignity, a phrase that sticks out in medieval legalese like a candle in a crypt. Another case from Florence tells of a group of women who cornered a known assailant and publicly shamed him, refusing to let him attend Mass. That may not sound like much, but in a society built on reputation and religious appearances, it was devastating. Scholars today debate just how prevalent sexual violence was in the Middle Ages. Some argue it was no worse than in later periods, just differently framed. Others insist the lack of reliable records hides a deeper, more systemic horror. But what they agree on is this: the systems of justice were built for men, and women who suffered had very few tools to fight back. So tonight, imagine a narrow village lane, damp with rain. A woman walks alone, eyes down. A man follows at a distance, his boots loud on the cobblestones. Tomorrow the town will talk. Maybe she'll say nothing. Maybe she'll go to the priest. Maybe she'll stay quiet for her family, for her survival. Because in this world, justice doesn't arrive on horseback. It arrives in whispers, in silence, or not at all. Next, we examine how families play dangerous games with marriage, power, and genetics. Because sometimes, in medieval castles, love stayed uncomfortably close to home. If you've been keeping score, you know by now that love and sex in medieval castles weren't exactly guided by heart-shaped arrows and romantic moonlit declarations. But tonight, we're descending even further into the murky depths of dynastic desire, the part where strategic marriages meet closed bloodlines. Yes, we're talking about incest, royal blood obsession, and the absolutely bonkers family trees that came from centuries of marrying your cousins, and occasionally your own niece. Because when your top priorities are keeping land, titles, and pure blood in the family, things start to get very complicated and a little unsettling. Let's set the scene. You're a nobleman in 12th century England. You've got a nice estate, a few dozen peasants working the land, a horse with decent stamina, and, crucially, a daughter who's of marrying age. But you don't want her marrying just anyone. Certainly not some second-born nobody from a rival house. No, you want her to marry someone within the family line, maybe your nephew, or your sister's son, just to keep everything tidy. Maybe they already know each other. Maybe they shared a cradle. But hey, what's a little shared DNA between landowners? This wasn't rare. Medieval aristocracy treated marriage like a chessboard, and the most powerful families were constantly trying to consolidate their wealth, territory, and political clout. Intermarriage among relatives, particularly among first and second cousins, was a standard move, and why not? Your cousin already shares your values, your alliances, and your coat of arms. Bonus, they live down the road. No need for awkward introductions. The church, interestingly, had thoughts on this. Lots of thoughts. Officially, consanguinity laws prohibited marriage within 7 degrees of kinship. That sounds strict, but those degrees were calculated based on canon law, math, which was its own fever dream. For example, your third cousin once removed might actually count as closer than your second cousin, depending on whether the connection came through your mother or your father. The church loved a good moral maze, but here's the kicker. Those rules were almost constantly ignored or conveniently bypassed. Noble families had a trick for this. They just petitioned for a dispensation from the Pope. And more often than not, the Pope said yes. Why? Because the church also liked power and money. If marrying your cousin meant your family would remain influential, loyal, and rich enough to donate a new chapel, suddenly God wasn't so fussy about the shared great-grandparents. It's amazing how quickly divine law becomes negotiable when you're building a new wing of the abbey. Some families didn't even bother with the paperwork, they just did it. Over time, this led to royal lineages that looked less like trees and more like knots. Take the Habsburgs, the ultimate poster children for marrying within the family. By the time they hit the 16th and 17th centuries, they were so entangled that their family portraits started to look familiar. Very familiar. The famous Habsburg jaw, that pronounced protruding lower lip and elongated face, wasn't just a weird genetic fluke. It was the visible result of generations of inbreeding. And then there's the infamous Charles II of Spain. By the time he took the throne in the 1600s, we're cheating a bit and peeking past the medieval period here, but trust me, he's relevant. His family tree was a loop. He was the product of repeated uncle-niece pairings, and his health reflected it. He suffered from multiple physical and mental disabilities, couldn't chew properly due to jaw malformation, and reportedly didn't speak until age 4, or walk until 8. The poor guy was a walking medieval warning label. Don't keep it that close. But the motivations went beyond just power. There was also a strange, deeply ingrained belief in the purity of royal blood. Marrying commoners, or even lower nobles, was often seen as degrading. To stay superior, you had to marry someone equally noble. And when you only consider a handful of families to be your equals, the dating pool starts to look more like a family reunion. Of course, the women involved in these unions rarely had a say. Daughters were traded like playing cards between allied houses, often betrothed before puberty. A girl might grow up knowing she'd one day marry her cousin, uncle, or brother-in-law. Love didn't enter the equation. Compatibility didn't matter. Fertility did. She was expected to bear children, especially sons, and cement the alliance. If the marriage failed to produce heirs, the blame almost always fell on her, even if her husband had the Habsburg gene pool working against him. In some cases, incestuous unions were hidden behind convenient labels. Adopted. Niece was a favourite. Spiritual sister sometimes meant mistress, and if a pregnancy occurred outside of marriage, particularly between relatives, the child might be passed off to a wet nurse, or quietly raised in a monastery, their parentage never officially recorded. Royal bastards were tolerated. Incestuous royal bastards, far less so. Occasionally, the whole thing backfired dramatically. Alliances built on blood became civil wars when the marriage crumbled. One notable disaster occurred during the Plantagenet era, when overlapping family claims triggered decades of infighting, and eventually the War of the Roses. So yes, all those cousin marriages did more than warp jawlines. They helped destabilise entire kingdoms. There's still scholarly debate over how widespread direct incest was. Sibling marriages, for instance, were vanishingly rare in Christian Europe. Most of the time, the relationship stayed just barely within the acceptable legal and religious limits. But even when they tiptoed close, the intent was clear. To keep everything in the family. The land, the titles, the power. And if the occasional birth defect or family feud popped up, well, that was just the cost of doing business. And here's a disturbing twist. Some cultures celebrated these unions, at least in legend. In certain Germanic folk tales, siblings separated at birth fall in love unknowingly, only to discover their true identities at the altar. The horror is often brushed aside, sometimes even reframed as destiny. It's as if the storytellers couldn't quite decide whether incest was taboo, tragic, or just a really awkward plot twist. So tonight, imagine a grand wedding feast in a stone hall, candles flickering against the cold stone. The bride is 14. The groom is 19 and also, somehow, her second cousin and her great-uncle's stepson. Everyone's smiling. The priest says the words, the deal is sealed. No one mentions the family resemblance, at least not out loud. Next, we'll pull away from dynastic doom and ask, what happened when your husband died? Because medieval widows weren't always tragic figures in black. Sometimes they rediscovered freedom, flirtation, and even lust. At last, we step out from under the heavy velvet of dynastic marriages and into the quieter but no less complicated world of widowhood. Now, when you hear the word widow in a medieval context, your mind might conjure a pale woman cloaked in black, eyes cast downward, rosary in hand, living out her days in sorrowful chastity. But let's be honest, while some widows absolutely leaned into that pious morning routine, others didn't. In fact, for many women, especially those of means, widowhood was a kind of rebirth, a second adolescence, a surprise retirement package with benefits. Because for the first time in their lives they had something rare, precious, and potentially scandalous: freedom. Let's rewind. You're a noblewoman in the 13th century. You were married off at 14 to a man 20 years older than you. He handled the estate, made the decisions, and generally treated you like a valuable but replaceable heir-producing machine. Over the years you gave him 5 children, 2 of whom survived, and listened to him talk about horse breeding every night at dinner. Then one day, poof, he falls off his horse, chokes on a turkey leg, or succumbs to some vaguely defined fever. Just like that, you're a widow. You're expected, of course, to mourn deeply, at least for a respectable amount of time. This could vary depending on region and custom, but often meant a year and a day of black clothing, reduced public appearances, and a pause on remarriage. But here's the thing, once that veil came off, so did a lot of social limitations. As a widow, especially a wealthy one, you were suddenly at the helm of your own ship. You could manage property, sign contracts, sue people in court, all without a man's permission. And you know what? Some widows thrived in this role. In fact, some women only really became themselves after their husbands died. Freed from constant childbirth, marital duty, and the oppressive expectation to obey, they took over their late husbands' estates and ran them better than the men ever had. In England and France, widows managed manors, oversaw servants, negotiated with tenants, and handled legal matters. One widow in 14th century Normandy not only maintained her estate but expanded it, buying up land from struggling neighbours, enforcing debts, and becoming something of a local legend, or villain, depending who you asked. Widows also had surprising freedom when it came to sex and relationships. Sure, the church would have preferred they stayed chaste, pious, and maybe moved into a convent for good measure. But not all widows were interested in a lifetime of quiet prayer. Many remarried, and quite a few took lovers before doing so. A noble widow could be courted by suitors from neighbouring estates, many of whom saw her as a prize. She had land, power, and proved she could survive marriage once already. There was even a phrase in some courtly texts about widows being seasoned in the arts of love, code for she knows what she's doing and she's not blushing about it. Some widows resisted the pressure to remarry entirely. Why give up control just to end up under another man's thumb? There are documented cases of women, especially wealthy ones, who flatly refused to take a second husband. One woman in Bruges famously responded to her family's attempts to match her with a young noble by declaring, "I have learned once what marriage is. I will not be schooled again. Mick drop." Of course, not all widows had such a smooth path. Poorer women, especially peasants, faced very different challenges. Without a husband's income or family support, they could find themselves in desperate situations. Many took on work as washerwomen, brewers, midwives, or servants. Others turned to begging or, in some cases, prostitution. In fact, a significant percentage of the women in medieval brothels were widows, women whose choices had narrowed to the point where survival outweighed reputation. Still, even among commoners, widowhood could offer opportunity. If a woman had children old enough to work, or if she inherited a small plot of land, she might live modestly but independently. In some towns, widow-led households were respected. In others, they were viewed with suspicion, partly because a woman on her own, with no man to control her, was seen as inherently threatening. After all, who was watching her? Who was keeping her in line? The answer sometimes was herself, and she might not have wanted to stay in line at all. There were even a few cheeky references in literature to widows who redecorated both their homes and their lives after mourning. One French poem from the 14th century describes a widow who waits exactly 1 year, then throws a feast, removes all her black clothing, and proceeds to flirt with 3 knights in one evening. The poem, unsurprisingly, ends with her remarrying and promptly bossing her new husband around. The moral? Widows weren't to be underestimated. And don't forget, sexual relationships outside of marriage were technically still frowned upon. But some widows played it smart. They hosted companions, often men of the lower rank who stayed in their households under vague titles like secretary or estate manager. These relationships were quiet but not always secret. Communities often looked the other way, unless the widow got pregnant, which could complicate things fast. In rarer cases, some widows became entangled with clergy. Monks and priests weren't immune to the allure of a powerful, intelligent woman who had already navigated life's harshest rites. These affairs, if discovered, usually ended in scandal or reassignment. But behind the curtain of church condemnation, human desire quietly carried on. After all, what was more tempting to a man trained in obedience and restraint than a woman who had learned to live without either? Scholars debate whether widowhood truly offered a path to liberation, or was just a brief window before another round of obligation. The truth probably lies in between. For some, widowhood was another cage, just with softer bars. For others, it was an open door, one through which they walked, heads high, hips swaying just a little more freely than before. So tonight, imagine a sun-dappled estate courtyard. A woman stands on a stone balcony, hair loose, black gown exchanged for deep green silk. Her steward hands her a list of tenants. A young knight arrives at the gate with flowers. She doesn't smile, not yet. She has a house to run, a name to protect, and, finally, a choice. Next, we turn the lights down and head back into the world of performance, where court jesters and troubadours weren't just entertaining. They were sometimes lovers, spies, and the original medieval thirst traps. So far, we've explored private chambers, dark corridors, and even the dangerous edges of power. But tonight, we step into the flickering candlelit courts, where the air hums with music, laughter, and something far more electric. Performance! Welcome to the world of medieval entertainers. The jesters, troubadours, minstrels, and courtly clowns who didn't just crack jokes and pluck lutes, but seduced, gossiped, flattered, and flirted their way into the bedchambers and secrets of the nobility. Because in a world where direct speech could get you beheaded, the ones who danced around the truth, often literally, held real power. Let's start with the troubadours, those wandering poet-musicians from southern France who basically invented the medieval love song. These weren't just guys with lutes and dreamy eyes. They were political players in silk tights. Their specialty? Courtly love. That beautifully tortured system of wooing where the object of desire was usually a noble lady, frequently married, and entirely out of reach. Which, let's be honest, only made things hotter. Troubadour poetry was packed with longing, metaphors, and just enough erotic tension to make everyone blush, while pretending they didn't get the joke. A woman's smile might be described as the sun warming my frozen soul, or her hair as a golden net that binds me to sin. These songs were usually performed aloud at court, often in the very presence of the woman being sung about. Everyone would pretend it was hypothetical, of course. Oh, the lady in the poem, just a symbol of divine love. Sure she is. What made these performances so dangerous and thrilling was that they walked a razor's edge between flattery and scandal. If a lady responded with a smile, a sigh, maybe a handkerchief dropped just a little too conveniently, everyone noticed. If she blushed too much, or if the lord of the manor happened to be suspicious, things could go from flirtation to full-blown feud. But sometimes it worked. Troubadours, with their flowing words and clever disguises, slipped into beds as easily as they slipped into song. There's one account of a noblewoman in Aquitaine who fell so deeply in love with a troubadour that she staged a fake illness just to keep him in her private chamber for days on end. He performed for her every night, and by performed, we're probably not just talking about music. The affair lasted for over a year before her husband caught wind. The troubadour was exiled, his songs banned. She, of course, was sent to a convent, but her chambermaid swore the lady never stopped humming his melodies. And then we have the jesters, the court fools. These were not just bumbling clowns in mismatched shoes. The good jester was a master of satire, timing, and subversion. They could speak truths others wouldn't dare to say, wrapped in riddles and jokes. A nobleman might not tolerate criticism from a knight, but from the fool? Well, that was just part of the act. Behind the motley was often a sharp, politically savvy mind. Jesters also had access that few others did. They moved freely between rooms, observed everything, and could say things like, "The king's beard smells of wine and regret," while grinning. Everyone laughed. But they also remembered. Some jesters doubled as spies, reporting back to powerful patrons. Others became confidants, trusted by queens, loved by servants, feared by ministers, and in a few notorious cases loved in quite a literal sense. One jester named Roland served in the court of a Hungarian duke, and was rumoured to be the secret lover of the Duchess herself. Witnesses claimed she laughed a little too hard at his jokes, invited him to her private balcony after feasts, and once had his jester's cap embroidered with pearls. When the duke died mysteriously, arrow wound in the dark, they said, Roland disappeared. So did the Duchess. A new song spread through the countryside, one that began, "A fool in bells and a lady fair vanished like whispers in castle air." Then there were the minstrels, the travelling entertainers who performed everything from bawdy ballads to epic tales of knights and dragons. Unlike troubadours, who were often noble-born or patronised by the elite, minstrels were usually commoners. But don't let the lower status fool you. A well-liked minstrel could gain entrance to noble halls, stay for weeks, charm the ladies, and collect secrets along with silver coins. They were the medieval equivalent of influencers, highly mobile, low-key dangerous, and always one catchy chorus away from stirring up gossip. Many minstrels kept books of songs, not literal books, but memorised collections. Some were romantic, some were dirty. One famous English ballad from the 13th century described a love triangle involving a lady, her squire, and a minstrel who kept interrupting their trysts with increasingly ridiculous verses. The song ends with the line, "She married none but the man who made her laugh between kisses." Was it real? Maybe not. But it captured something about the era's hunger for laughter and love in the same breath. Performance also offered a kind of license for gender play. In certain festivals and courtly masques, Men dressed as women, women dressed as men, and everyone collectively agreed to pretend it wasn't happening. In these moments of inverted norms, sexuality became a game, fluid, performative, and delightfully confusing. A young page might play a maiden so convincingly that half the court fell in love. A noble lady might don armour and woo another woman in jest, only to keep the armour on long after the curtain fell. The church naturally disapproved, particularly of the lascivious songs, the gender-bending, and the insinuation that pleasure might be found in disguise. But courts were places of contradiction. A bishop might thunder about sin in the morning and attend a bawdy performance that night, wine in hand, cheeks flushed from laughter. That tension, the space between piety and play, was where these entertainers thrived. Some even wrote coded songs mocking the very people who paid them. A troubadour might compare a lord to a goat in heat, or imply the queen was bored in her marriage. As long as the rhyme was clever and the insult indirect, they got away with it. It was an art form rooted in misdirection, innuendo, and emotional sleight of hand. And here's the twist. Sometimes these performers were the most honest people in the room. They sang about longing, about desire denied, about the absurdity of rigid roles. Their songs offered catharsis, humour, and just maybe a spark of rebellion. After all, when everything around you is about duty and control, the fool who speaks in riddles starts sounding like a prophet. So tonight, imagine a firelit hall full of nobles in stiff collars and glazed eyes. A troubadour enters, strums a chord, and begins a song about forbidden love in a castle not unlike this one. The lady of the manor lowers her goblet. The knight beside her frowns. The jester grins from the shadows. And somewhere in the chorus truth flickers for just a moment, dressed in rhyme, cloaked in laughter, and utterly undeniable. Next time, we head out of the castle gates and into the town, because sexuality didn't end at the drawbridge. In the streets, taverns, and brothels of the medieval city, desire was loud, rowdy, and never far from trouble. If everything within the castle walls was cloaked in tapestries and whispered behind veils, outside the gates things got a lot more visceral, lusty, muddy. Welcome to the medieval town, where the streets smell faintly of sweat, firewood, and maybe something worse, and where sexuality walks freely in public, rarely bothering with poetry or subtlety. This is the realm of brothels and bathhouses, of tavern songs and alley trysts, of people living loud, messy, bodily lives. Because while the castle might write love letters, the town scribbles lust on the backs of bar tabs and breathes heavy behind market stalls. Let's start with the brothels, because yes, they were everywhere, and yes, they were often officially sanctioned. Medieval cities across Europe, from Paris to London to Nuremberg, had designated red light districts, sometimes called stew streets, after the public bathhouses often found there. These weren't underground secret affairs, they were municipal realities, regulated, taxed, sometimes even inspected by the city council. Imagine your local mayor doing a monthly walkthrough of the local pleasure quarter with a checklist and a mild expression of concern. That's not a joke. It happened. Prostitution was viewed as a necessary evil. Something sinful, yes, but tolerated to protect good women from male lust. Better to have a place where unmarried men could let off steam, the logic went, than risk seduction or assault of virtuous wives and daughters. So city officials created these red light zones, set rules, and in some cases even built the brothels themselves. A lot of these were surprisingly well organised. The women had to register with local authorities, pay fees or taxes, and follow curfews. They weren't allowed to wear fashionable clothing or jewellery in public, and many had to wear a specific coloured sash or veil to mark their profession. Inside, the brothels ranged from shabby smoky rooms above alehouses to luxurious establishments with painted walls, feather beds, and warm wine waiting by the door. The clientele varied: sailors, soldiers, merchants, bored apprentices, and even the occasional monk who wandered in by mistake. Prices were negotiable, services were varied, and rules were flexible. For the women working in these spaces, life was complicated. Some were there by choice, often out of economic necessity. Widows, orphans, or young women cut off from family support might turn to sex work as their only viable option. Others were coerced, sold, or tricked into it. And then there were those who did it with a sense of control and even pride. women who learn to navigate the system, keep a portion of their earnings, and establish loyal, wealthy clients. Some madams, women who owned or ran brothels, became minor celebrities in their towns, known for throwing wild parties and collecting secrets like coins. Bathhouses added another layer to the picture. These weren't just places to get clean, they were social spaces, often co-ed, and sometimes blurred the line between hygiene and intimacy. You'd go in for a bath, maybe a massage, maybe a hot meal, and depending on the house, maybe a little more. City ordinances frequently tried to separate legitimate bathhouses from those offering special services, but let's just say enforcement was spotty. A bathhouse with extra amenities might wink at its customers with coded signs or discreet backrooms, and even in the clean ones, the combination of nudity, warm water and social mingling made for a naturally flirtatious environment. Not everything was organised though. Some sex work happened in alleys, behind market stalls, or in rented rooms in inns. There's one story from 14th century Florence of a woman who kept a love nest above her father's bakery, claiming it was storage space, while sneaking clients up the stairs. She wasn't caught until a bishop, craving a sweet roll, walked in unannounced and saw more buns than he bargained for. And then there were the travelling sex workers, women and some men, who followed armies, festivals, or trade fairs. These folks operated on the fringes, sleeping in tents or wagons, offering services in exchange for coin, food, or even safety. Town officials often looked the other way during busy seasons, only to kick them out again once the carnival ended or the soldiers marched on. Of course, all this official tolerance came with massive double standards. While the men visiting brothels faced little more than a slap on the wrist or a fine, the women bore the brunt of society's judgment. They could be publicly shamed, barred from church, or blamed for outbreaks of disease. In times of crisis, plague, war, famine, the very cities that taxed and regulated brothels might turn on the workers, accusing them of moral corruption or divine punishment. One town in Germany literally banished its entire red light district during a crop failure, claiming the women's sins had angered the heavens. The following year, the same women were quietly invited back when the harvest still failed, just with less public fanfare. Despite this, sex workers weren't always on the margins. Some found their way into the hearts and households of their clients. There are records of wealthy merchants who married their favourite courtesans, of soldiers who brought lovers home from campaigns, and of nobles who kept long-time mistresses openly. In a few remarkable cases, former sex workers climbed the social ladder. One woman in 15th century Bruges eventually ran an estate and became a patron of local artists. Her early career? Bathhouse hostess. Sometimes the hustle paid off. And what about male sex workers? They existed too, though far less visibly. Young men, known as ragazzi in Italian cities or Ganymedes in French broadsheets, offered services to both men and women. Their lives were often more precarious, not just because of legal persecution, but because male same-sex activity carried the risk of severe punishment. Still, they moved through the night, whispering in shadows, occasionally immortalised in graffiti or scandalous poetry. The church condemned all of it, naturally. But even clergy were often among the clientele. Confessionals echoed with regret and repetition. One record from Avignon lists a priest who confessed to visiting the same brothel for 13 years, always with the same woman. The penance, 3 Hail Marys and a donation to the poor. It's almost charming in its cosmic irony. Scholars still debate whether medieval cities were permissive or simply pragmatic. Was this tolerance a sign of open-mindedness or control? Probably both. What's clear is that sexuality wasn't hidden behind castle walls or cloistered in noble marriages. It was alive in the streets. It danced through taverns. It whispered in doorways. It existed in bodies that weren't always respectable, but were absolutely real. So tonight, picture a bustling street just after sundown. Lanterns glow, a lute plays faintly. A woman in a crimson sash leans in a doorway, eyes meeting yours with a practised smile. Down the alley, a bathhouse door creaks open. Inside, steam rises. Laughter echoes. And in the hum of the city, desire pulses, raw, risky, unapologetic. Next, we wander into the most paradoxical of spaces, the confessional booth. Because for every sin of the flesh, there was a priest ready to listen, and maybe, just maybe, to sin a little himself. Step quietly now, because we're entering a very different kind of space. Dim, wood-panelled, echoing with whispers. It smells like incense and dust, like something ancient and slightly guilty. This is the confessional booth, where sin goes to be named, counted, and, ideally, erased. And when it comes to sex in the Middle Ages, this tiny box of carved oak was a spiritual courtroom, a pressure valve, and, depending on the priest, a hotbed of hypocrisy. Because while medieval people were certainly doing all kinds of things behind closed doors, they were also confessing it, sometimes in lurid detail. And those listening? Well, not all of them kept their thoughts pure. Let's start with how confession actually worked. Around the 12th century, the Church formalised the practice of private confession. Before that, penance was more public. Think standing barefoot in the snow while your neighbours whispered. But by the High Middle Ages, confessions moved into shadowy booths, or were whispered in side chapels, often one-on-one. You knelt, you listed your sins, and the priest listened, nodded solemnly and assigned penance. Sometimes fasting, sometimes almsgiving, sometimes walking on your knees around a church altar until you couldn't feel your shins. But here's the twist. Confession wasn't just a moral practice. It was also a window into the private lives of medieval people. And oh boy, what a window. Priests kept manuals, thick, grimy, Latin-filled books known as penitentials that listed every possible sexual sin and exactly how many prayers or punishments it would cost to be forgiven. These manuals read like the world's most awkward FAQ. What if the man removes his seed outside the womb? What if the woman climbs atop the man? What if both parties enjoy it too much? Yes, all real questions, real sins, real penances. The level of detail is shocking. One Anglo-Saxon penitential goes so far as to assign different punishments based on the day the sin occurred. Sex on Sunday? Worse than Wednesday. Sex during Lent? Oh, you better believe that's getting you 10 years in purgatory and a diet of barley bread and river water. And forget about having sex on a feast day. It was seen as directly insulting the saint in question. One poor soul confessed to having relations with his wife during Easter Mass. His priest made him fast for 40 days, attend 3 extra services a week, and pay for a new church candle. Nothing like buying absolution by the inch. And lest you think it was all married folks trying to squeeze in a little post-harvest affection, think again. Unmarried couples, widows with lovers, people experimenting with anything beyond the strict heterosexual missionary playbook, they all poured out their confessions in terrified detail. Many were taught to examine themselves nightly, asking whether they'd sinned in thought, word or deed. Some confessed lustful dreams, others confessed to simply wanting someone they weren't supposed to. Desire itself was a kind of pre-sin, a red flag waving to let the devil know the gate was open. Which brings us to the priests themselves. They were supposed to be above all this, right? Models of chastity, spiritual guides, shepherds for the lost, and yet they were human, tempted, flawed, and sometimes very much part of the problem. There are countless records of priests who used confession to manipulate, seduce, or outright abuse. The confessional was private, vulnerable, full of emotional weight. A woman might confess to impure thoughts about a man she'd seen in the market. Her priest could then say, but the man in question, was it me? Yes, that line actually appears in one 14th century case from Italy. Real subtle, father. In some regions, bishops issued warnings about seductive confessors. They were told not to ask probing questions unless absolutely necessary, and to avoid giving absolution with undue familiarity. But those rules were hard to enforce. In the intimacy of confession, when one party held spiritual power and the other held shame, the balance could tilt dangerously. Some women were blackmailed into silence. Others were told that sex with the priest could cleanse their soul. That may sound absurd, but in a world where priests were seen as direct links to God, spiritual manipulation had real power. There were also priests who confessed themselves, to other clergy or even anonymously in writing. Some wrote tortured letters, begging for guidance after breaking their vows. One monk in Germany confessed to falling in love with a widow he'd been advising. "I feel her voice in my chest when I pray," he wrote. "Is this not also a kind of divine music?" His superior instructed him to take a pilgrimage barefoot through the Alps. He made it halfway, then turned around and reportedly married the widow in secret. Confession also served as a bizarre kind of community archive. Parish priests sometimes compiled anonymous reports of common sins in their districts. These documents reveal everything from mass adultery to secret marriages to elaborate rural fertility rituals involving, you guessed it, naked dancing and symbolic ploughing. These weren't always condemned outright. In some cases the church tried to adapt, reframe the rituals as symbolic blessings rather than pagan leftovers. But when things got too spicy, penance was handed out like candy at Lent. Despite the gloom of all this, confession had a weirdly therapeutic side. For many, it was the only place to unburden themselves, to say things aloud, to be heard, even if judgment followed. A woman might confess to kissing her neighbour's husband and walk away feeling, if not clean, at least less alone. Some confessors were genuinely kind. They listened, without scorn. They assigned gentle penance. They reminded the sinner that God was merciful even when the world wasn't. And it's worth remembering, not all medieval people bought into the guilt factory. Some confessed because they had to, because it was required for communion, or because their family pressured them. But once outside the booth, they kept living their lives. They went back to lovers, to secret rendezvous, to the same sins they'd just listed. The confessional became part of a rhythm: sin, confess, repeat, a medieval cycle of emotional laundry. You didn't have to stop living, you just had to say sorry every now and then. So tonight, imagine a stone church at dusk, its windows glowing. Inside, a booth sits in shadow. A woman kneels, her hands trembling slightly. The priest leans close, his breath warm against the grate. She whispers a name. He nods. In that moment, sin isn't gone. It's just shared. Next, as we close in on our journey's end, we enter the realm of medicine and myth. Because when it came to sexual health, medieval people had plenty of ideas, and most of them were somewhere between terrifying and hilarious. And now, dear traveller through time and temptation, we come to the final hall in our twisted tour of medieval sexuality, the chamber of health and horror. Because if there's one thing the Middle Ages loved as much as gilt and velvet curtains, it was medical theories that sounded like a dare. Tonight, we're plunging into the world of medieval sexual health. The potions, the diagnoses, the body fluids measured and weighed like moral decisions. It's where sex, science, superstition, and sheer guesswork tangle together like a poorly tied corset. You'll laugh. You'll cringe. You may never look at garlic or goat milk the same way again. Let's begin with the basics. Medieval medicine was built on ancient Greek theory, particularly the work of Galen and Hippocrates, whose ideas about the body's four humours dominated European thinking for centuries. The body, according to these thinkers, was governed by four substances: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and every illness, including those of a sexual nature, was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these fluids. Feeling sluggish and uninterested in your husband? Too much black bile. Burning desire for your local priest? Probably an excess of blood and possibly demonic possession. Easy fix. One of the strangest ideas that stuck around for an embarrassingly long time was that women were naturally cold and men were hot. This wasn't a personality judgment, it was a literal description of bodily temperature. Women, being colder and wetter, were believed to require the heat of a man to activate their fertility. This led to the notion that women needed sex not only for reproduction, but for physical health. Some physicians claimed that if a woman went too long without intercourse, her womb could become wandering, floating freely through the body, causing hysteria, suffocation, and erratic behaviour. That's right, the wandering womb. It was a serious diagnosis. One 14th century medical manual describes it this way: when the womb is not pleased, it moves upward and presses against the heart, giving the woman visions and panic. The treatment? Aromatherapy. The doctor would place sweet-smelling herbs near the woman's genitals and foul-smelling substances near her nose, hoping to lure the womb back down like a moody cat. There were also more hands-on approaches. Midwives were sometimes instructed to perform genital massage to stimulate flow. Some historians interpret this as a polite way of saying manual sexual release, administered as a medical necessity. Yes, medieval gynecological care might have involved a spa day from your local village healer, complete with scented oils and strong opinions about your humours. For men, sexual dysfunction was typically blamed on coldness, weakness, or evil spirits. Impotence could be treated with warm poultices of mashed leeks and honey, or by wearing a weasel's testicles around the neck. One German remedy involved drinking a potion made from rooster brains and ash bark, followed by vigorous horse riding. Whether this improved stamina or simply terrified the patient into performance remains unclear. Condoms, you ask? Sort of. In certain regions, especially during outbreaks of disease, men began to use linen sheaths tied with ribbon. Primitive, washable, and about as romantic as wrapping your nether regions in a handkerchief. These early condoms weren't really for birth control, though. They were mostly a response to the growing awareness of sexually transmitted diseases, especially syphilis. Which brings us to that lovely topic. By the late medieval period, people began to whisper more often about mysterious diseases that caused genital sores, madness, and death. Syphilis, also called the French disease by the Italians, the Neapolitan disease by the French, and the Polish disease by basically everyone else, became the scapegoat of choice when anyone developed suspicious symptoms. Treatments included mercury vapor baths, rubbing with tree bark, and something called smoke chamber therapy, which involved standing naked over burning herbs while chanting prayers. Spoiler, it didn't work. But hey, at least you smelled festive while dying. For contraception and abortion, medieval medicine offered a cornucopia of questionable advice. We've touched on pennyroyal, tansy and rue, herbs used to prevent or terminate pregnancy, but there were other concoctions too. Some medical texts advised women to drink wine boiled with dried bee carcasses or to wear amulets made from fox intestines. One guide recommended binding a small frog to the inside of the thigh to repel conception. Another involved inserting a mixture of olive oil and crushed ants. We're not saying any of this worked, but someone, somewhere, was willing to try. Men too had their own precoital preparations. Some chewed garlic to heat the blood, while others swore by oysters soaked in goat's milk. For added insurance, you might rub a charm onto your skin, perhaps engraved with Latin prayers, or shaped like a phallus, which was more common than you'd think. Archaeologists have found dozens of tiny carved penises worn as protective amulets. The idea? Fertility and protection, all in one portable, mildly alarming package. Of course, all this came with a heavy dose of moral panic. The church monitored physicians carefully, warning them not to promote sinful behaviour. A healer caught treating sexual dysfunction too enthusiastically might be accused of encouraging lust or, worse, dabbling in witchcraft. Midwives were especially at risk. If they provided abortions, contraception, or pleasure-enhancing remedies, they could be branded as heretics, even if they were simply trying to help desperate women. Still, some church figures acknowledged the need for basic medical care. A few monks translated ancient Greek texts that included sexual health advice, and some nuns wrote surprisingly detailed treatises on women's anatomy. One anonymous abbess penned a guide for young women entering the convent that included diagrams, herbal recipes, and a stern warning: guard thy belly, for the devil desires entry through desire. Whether that was metaphorical or literal is unclear, but the message was obvious. Temptation lurks everywhere, especially in your own body. Scholars today debate just how seriously these medical beliefs were taken. Some argue that most people, especially commoners, followed folk knowledge passed down orally rather than consulting formal medicine. Others believe even the most bizarre theories, wandering wombs, goat testicles, scented frog amulets, were held with genuine conviction. What's certain is that sexual health was never just physical. It was spiritual, social, political. Every part of the body was a battleground. And yet medieval people were still just people. They worried about fertility. They panicked over strange pains. They giggled about love potions and got annoyed when the remedy tasted like old socks. They fumbled, whispered, guessed. Some got better, some didn't. Some healed with prayer, others with honey and ashes. All of them, in one way or another, just trying to survive the chaos of desire in a world that didn't always know what to do with it. So tonight, imagine a flickering chamber filled with dried herbs and clay jars. A woman sits at a table, crushing roots. A man stands awkwardly, holding a bundle of garlic and asking, "Will this help?" The healer doesn't laugh. She nods slowly. "If not," she says, "come back next week. I've got something stronger, but it smells worse. Now, dim the lights. The journey's almost done. Take a breath. Let's settle in for a short wind down, A last look at everything we've uncovered behind the stone walls of those mysterious medieval castles. You've made it. 30 nights, or however many hours it took you to wander down this winding, candlelit corridor of medieval sexuality. We've peeked through keyholes, ducked into hidden chambers, passed between brothels and balconies, and listened through the cracks of confessional booths. Now, the torches burn low, the castles grow quiet, and all that's left is to settle in, reflect, and maybe raise a sleepy eyebrow at how wildly, stubbornly, hilariously human medieval people really were. Because let's be honest, going into this, you probably had assumptions. Maybe you pictured chastity